You're listening to Red Corvette, a Boat Angel Family Films production, written by Brian Stewart and narrated by Alexa Lee. Audio recording copyright 2021, Boat Angel Family Films. Section 1.
The furious sound of the sleek red Corvette ripping through the narrow alleyway was deafening. Like a bullet through water, the car smoothly broke through space, time, and sound, demanding attention for its power and strength. The noise that filled the alleyway was a mixture of the sleek metal breaking through the air, the wheels pressing down on the gravel in a rhythmic pattern, and the piercing, loud music that blared out of the car's windows. Light reflected and shimmered like dancing demons from the smooth red metal curves as sunlight hit them. The red Corvette was a loud, blazing red flame burning through the road. With a loud screech of the tires, the car pulled out to the street and took a sharp right turn. It was just a few feet away from an old brick house with large white Greek letters on its front. Smoothly, the vibrant red car slowed to a stop before a sign that read, Alpha Omega Chi Sorority, San Antonio, Texas. The two young men inside the car sat motionless for a brief second, allowing the passerby walking on the sidewalk to admire them. Two college girls walked past the red Corvette and started. When they caught a glimpse of the two handsome men inside the car, they giggled nervously, as if standing before movie stars. Doug, who had been driving the car, reached out and turned down the music. With Hendrix's Purple Haze now in the background, he turned to Johnny and lifted up his brown eyebrows in a questioning motion. He was a tall man in his late 20s, obviously fit and strong. He had a strong, square jaw and deep-set dark blue eyes, which sparkled against his very light blonde hair, kept in a trendy short and messy cut, with long sideburns that most women found deeply alluring. He was wearing a pair of Tommy Hilfiger khakis and a light blue polo shirt, looking like a G.I. Joe figure on an off day. Without lowering his eyebrows, Doug smiled and jokingly challenged Johnny. "Go on, you said you could get them to come." Johnny lifted up his Tom Cruise-style aviator sunglasses to reveal dark brown eyes set in heavy eyebrows and long eyelashes. His hair was dark and wavy, loosely combed back to reveal a handsome face. He was as tall as Doug, but slightly leaner. His body was muscular, but not big, covered by a network of protruding manly veins. In his tight white t-shirt and torn and faded jeans, he fit the image of a bad boy perfectly. Looking annoyed that someone would doubt his conquering powers, he opened the door and answered Doug as he stepped out of the car. "No problem, just wait, you'll see." Johnny stepped out of the car and slowly combed back his hair to the admiring looks of the young female college students coming in and out of the Greek house. He put his sunglasses back on and confidently strolled to the entrance of the sorority house. Doug shook his head and smiled. Johnny was quite the character. He turned the volume back up and looked abstractly at the girls walking by. He tapped the rhythm of the electric guitar on the glossy door of his loved car as he got ready to wait a few minutes for Johnny to return. But it was less than 2 minutes before he heard the sound of girly giggles approaching the car. Johnny was walking back from the house with two young and very friendly-looking college girls, one on each of his sides. Mindy, a short and perky blonde, was laughing as Johnny teasingly pulled on the strap of her tank top. She was a pretty girl with a freckled nose and perfect white teeth. Her blonde hair was tied up in a neat ponytail, and her tank top and short shorts showed off her tanned and athletic figure, the result of being part of the university's swim team. Her friend Nancy was only a bit taller, with light brown hair that she had down over her shoulders. She was also dressed in short shorts and a tank top. This was almost the uniform for the college girls. Nancy was not as tanned as Mindy and looked more delicate than her sporty friend. Johnny approached the Corvette and, with an artistic flair, bowed and presented the car and his friend to the girls. "Ladies, this is my best friend and personal lawyer, Doug Thomas." Doug smiled and looked pleasantly surprised. Johnny's charm with girls never failed, but this time he had picked up two particularly pretty girls. Doug especially liked Cindy's delicate appearance and friendly but shy look. He jumped out of the car to open the door for the girls, playing along with Johnny's gentlemanly act. Johnny smiled at Doug and, gesturing toward the girls, bowed again, saying, "Doug, may I please present the ladies, Cindy and Nancy." Mindy giggled and playfully hit Johnny on the arm. "Mindy, not Cindy." Doug bowed like Sir Galahad with a smile and then extended his hands to the girls. "Nice to meet you, Mindy. And you too, Nancy. You girls want to go down to the river with us? We know a truly breathtaking spot." Nancy looked at Mindy and shrugged. Sure, why not? Tomorrow's a holiday." Mindy barely heard Nancy, however, as the shining car had captured her full attention. She walked over to the Corvette and slowly stroked its curves. With a flirtatious look, she turned to Johnny and in her most alluring voice asked, "Is this your car, Johnny?" Johnny sighed under his breath and tried to laugh off the comment. "No, maybe someday," he said, walking over to take Mindy's hands. "Mine's in the shop." Mindy looked again at the car, and a new thought occurred to her. With a confused look, she asked, "How are we all going to fit?" Doug started walking towards the driver's seat as he replied, "One person can sit in the back seat." Johnny embraced Mindy and sweetly said, "And Mindy, if you want, you can squish in the passenger seat with me." Mindy giggled again and followed Nancy into the car. The drive to the river was short, and the two couples were soon enjoying the soothing warmth of a Texas spring day in the clear waters of a small pond. A few large boulders near a waterfall had created the natural pond with crystal-clear temperate water. Large and full evergreens and dense pine trees surrounded the small pond on all sides, separating it almost entirely from the world. It was a heavenly refuge made of leaves and water. Following Doug and Johnny's example, Mindy and Nancy took off everything but their underwear and jumped into the clear, cool water. The water received them like refreshing silk in the afternoon heat. It caressed their young skin in the most soft and invigorating way. All four of them enjoyed just laying in the secret virginal watery heaven for a few minutes. Johnny, however, could not just lay still for long. Tempted by glances of Mindy's shapely figure, he began to splash water towards her softly while pretending to do nothing. Soon a water fight broke out between the two, which Doug and Nancy immediately joined. Laughter and screams soon accompanied the sound of the nearby waterfall. Johnny splashed water directly at Mindy's face, which momentarily blinded her. Not wasting a second, he quickly approached her from behind and pulled away her underwear. Taken by surprise, Mindy shrieked and dove underwater in a desperate chase after her underwear. She came up again a few feet away, laughing. She put all her strength into splashing water back at Johnny as she laughed and asked, "What are you trying to do, drown me?" Johnny valiantly resisted the water coming straight at his face and walked directly towards Mindy. Spitting water out as he spoke, he replied, No, I would never want to drown you or hurt you in any way." In a second, he was close enough to Mindy so that she could no longer splash water at him, and he could put his arms around her. Looking down intently into her eyes, he asked, "Do you want to go for a little walk?" Mindy smiled and slipped away from his grasp, taking her underwear from his hand. She casually swam away, but turned back to look at Johnny as she climbed out of the pond. With her usual girly and yet flirtatious smile, she answered, "Sure, just let me get some clothes and shoes on." Johnny followed her out of the water and threw on his jeans and t-shirt. He turned back and noticed that Doug and Nancy had also gotten out of the water and were sunbathing on one of the large, smooth rocks. "Hey, Doug, we're going to go upstream to see what's there. We'll be back in a little while." The afternoon sun, like a warm embrace, was lulling Doug to sleep, and he didn't want to open his eyes or mouth to answer Johnny. Lazily, he lifted up his hand in a thumbs-up sign. Johnny turned and nodded for Mindy to follow him up the path. The mountain waited for them with unspoken secrets and pleasures. It was not a difficult hike, and the pair quickly made their way upstream. At every step, they were surrounded by flowering lavender and evergreens. The clean and soft aroma of the romantic lavender flowers marked every step in a narrow path filled with lights and shadows. It was a solitary path and seldom used. The fact that few humans had visited it in the last few months was evident by the many twisted and hard branches that blocked the way like warning arms. Johnny took the lead and vigorously pulled branches to the side to open the way for Mindy. His wet shirt stuck to his muscles, which flexed as he pulled the branches to the side. His hair had become far curlier than before he went swimming, and playfully falling over his sweaty forehead and face gave him an almost youthful charm over his strongly chiseled and manly face. They came across a large Palo Verde tree with a thick and gnarly branch blocking their way. Johnny softly pulled it back so that Mindy could pass under it without having to break the branch. Before either of them could go past the branch, however, a strange cracking sound stopped them on their tracks. Johnny looked up and saw a strange piece of metal falling through the branches only a couple of feet in front of him. He let go of the branch almost mechanically and rushed over to investigate the noise. Several feet behind him, Mindy had only seen a falling shadow and heard a loud noise like thunder cracking far away. "What's that?" she asked as she came up to Johnny kneeling by the fallen metal. Johnny was busy trying to turn over the piece of metal to find out whatever he could. "Looks like part of an airplane wing," cleaning the debris of cake mud and dirt from the airplane wing with his hand, trying to make out any writing. Mindy looked at the remainders of the wing in surprise and started looking around for other pieces. "I haven't heard of any reports of plane crashes around here," she said. "Have you?" "No, maybe someone was flying really low, trying to beat the radar, you know. Keep looking around. I'm going to climb up this tree and see if I can spot anything else." Led by his excitement, Johnny quickly made his way up the tree. He used the heels of his cowboy boots to prevent himself from slipping, and his strong biceps to pull himself from one branch to the next. He was covered in sweat and panting by the time he made it to the top. The sun, far brighter at the top of the tree than it had been in the covered path below, initially blinded him. He grabbed onto a branch to regain his breath and sight, and with a deep breath yelled down to Mindy, "Anything down there?" Mindy's voice reached him only faintly. He had not realized how quickly he had climbed in just a few minutes. "Yeah, it looks like part of a propeller over here. It's pretty rusted. What do you see up there?" Johnny turned to look around the top of the old tree. He was a good head above all the trees surrounding him, and he had a majestic view of the surrounding area. He could glimpse red-purple hills in the distance, and all around him was a green sea of trees that moved with the afternoon breeze. Every so often, a large rock broke through the green canopies like a ship stranded at sea. The course of the river could also be made out far below. It was a shining silver thread that danced this way and that around the trees and rocks. The sky was free of any clouds and turned a melancholic shade of blue with hints of amber in it. It was a breathtaking sight, and Johnny couldn't help but remain silent for a few moments, taking it all in. During that moment, the world seemed so much greater than the life of any single man. "Johnny, have you found anything?" Mindy's voice brought Johnny back to the present, and he turned to start the climb down. Only then did he catch a glimpse of a large green canvas bag hanging a few feet below to his left. Carefully, he made his way over and grabbed the bag. The bag was tangled on a couple of thorny branches and had a small rip on the side. Johnny put his hands on the rip and pulled hard to make it larger. The canvas material resisted for a second and then tore several inches. Johnny pushed his strong hand through the hole and grabbed a fistful of whatever was inside. He carefully pulled his hand out and curiously opened his hand close to his face. His hand was covered with a leafy small plant. Johnny lifted his hand to his nose and slowly smelled what he was holding. There was no doubt this was good quality marijuana, only recently dried. Johnny whistled under his breath. "Whew, there must be a fortune here," he murmured under his breath. A devious smile spread across his handsome face. "Bombs away!" he yelled out to Mindy. "I got something. Stand clear." Mindy looked up to see Johnny struggling to tease something out of the Palo Verde's branches several feet up in the air. "Be careful, you're way up there." After some struggling, Johnny succeeded in freeing the package from the branches and let it go. The bag crashed down, breaking a few branches on the way, but ended up caught a few feet above the ground in front of Mindy. Johnny excitedly clambered down to the bag and loosened it again. With a loud clatter, the bag tumbled to the ground. Mindy rushed to it and began to examine it as she called up to Johnny. "What is it?" Johnny jumped down from the tree and casually brushed himself clean before walking over to the bag. "It's my new Porsche," he responded with a broad smile of pure childish delight covering his face. As Johnny walked over to her, Mindy found the hole on the side of the canvas bag and pulled out some of the marijuana. She looked at the herbs in her hand confusedly. She turned to Johnny with her hand covered in marijuana like a strange glove. "New Porsche?" she asked, with a puzzled look on her face. Johnny walked right past Mindy, seeming not to notice her confusion, and kneeled by the bag, approaching it almost like a lover does his beloved. He took another pinch of the stuff from the bag and rubbed it softly between his fingers. "Yeah, there's probably 70,000 worth of pot in here." He closed his eyes and deeply inhaled the aroma of the herb. "It looks and smells like Panama Red." Mindy stood frozen in place with a mixture of shock and surprise in her face. Her eyes opened wide when she realized how familiar Johnny was to be with this drug. She looked at him and was almost afraid to ask whether he was planning to keep the bag. "You're not going to keep it, are you?" she asked in a soft, timid voice. "You know it's illegal." Johnny turned to look at Mindy as though she was crazy. He frowned and sounded deeply annoyed as he answered, "You're not serious, are you? What do you think I'm going to do? Throw it away? This is the kind of thing I've been waiting for. It's my golden opportunity to make something out of myself." His voice had turned both hopeful and angry, and Mindy felt even more intimidated by the tall, muscular man before her. "A drug dealer?" asked Mindy with a look of fear and disgust crossing her face. "That's what you call making something out of yourself?" "Yeah, why not?" replied Johnny, looking angrily at Mindy. His voice had a sharp and violent edge to it as he approached Mindy. He was standing over her as he almost yelled. "My old man was a research chemist in Jersey. They laid him off when they moved their operation to Guatemala. You think I'm going to work for some corporation? No thanks. I'm done with serving someone else and always being afraid of the future." His face suddenly became calm again. He turned and walked back to the bag. He picked it up with a bit of a struggle. He carefully laid it over his shoulder like a precious idol and said jubilantly, "This is my ticket to freedom." Without looking at Mindy again, he started to make his way back down the path. Mindy's eyes filled with burning hot tears. She shook her hand clean of the marijuana that was still stuck there, tried to dry her eyes, and rushed to follow Johnny before he was too far away. She quietly fell into step behind him. Johnny didn't speak to Mindy for the rest of the hike. When he reached the pond, he quickly told Doug and Nancy what he had found at the top of the tree. Nancy, much like Mindy, was dumbstruck with surprise and then fear when she heard Johnny say that he wanted to keep the drugs. Doug wanted to ask a couple of questions, but he could tell that Johnny was in a mood and he knew it was better to not push him. Johnny was known for having a temper that could turn violent even against his closest friends. Nancy and Doug put on their clothes and the four of them walked back to the car in silence. Nancy noticed that Mindy's eyes were teary and she quietly put her arm around her warmly. Doug and Johnny dropped the girls off at their sorority house in a much more somber tone than they had picked them up. Doug said goodbye to Nancy with a kiss, but Johnny still refused to speak to Mindy. It was only after the girls were gone and Doug was driving to Johnny's apartment that the conversation started up between the two men. Johnny began to plan aloud how he would distribute and sell his stash to make the most money. He was flying on cloud 9, imagining all the things he would be able to get and the power and prestige he would have. Doug listened attentively and contributed with his own ideas. Following his advice, they stopped in a supermarket where Johnny bought some plastic folders and scales. Doug dropped Johnny off and drove off. He couldn't stay, he said, because he was behind on some urgent paperwork for his firm. Before leaving, however, he took a generous helping of the goods with him. "To test it out," he told Johnny with a smile. Johnny's apartment was a dark place. Most of the walls were painted navy blue, and only a few white and black posters of electric guitars and cars decorated the walls. Johnny sat on his old and broken dark red leather couch and began to separate his weed into the plastic folders after carefully measuring it on the scale. Slowly, he prepared a joint for himself and took long, leisurely drags. The weed was strong and smooth. In minutes, his eyes were bloodshot and his thoughts were slower and calmer. Feeling himself more powerful before the world than he had ever felt before, Johnny started calling up his contacts to put his stuff on the market. After making a few phone calls, he dozed off into a heavy sleep. He would have slept through the whole night if the phone had not rung. As if coming out of a daze, he grabbed the phone and drowsily said, "Hello?" Mindy's girly voice came across the line. "Johnny, I was just calling to see if you would come to our party this weekend. It's a tripped out 60s party. You know, psychedelic. I hope you're not still upset about today." Johnny rubbed his eyes. The weed had made him feel a deep calm, and he had almost forgotten how annoyed and angry he had been at Mindy. "Sounds fun," he answered, and to Mindy's surprise added, "How are your classes going anyways?" "Great." Mindy was only too happy to hear how calm and friendly Johnny sounded all of a sudden. "How are you?" she asked cautiously. "Fine. Yeah, really fine. Oh, can I ask Doug to come along on Saturday? Does Nancy have a date?" "No, go ahead and ask him. I'm sure she'd love it," answered Mindy, getting more excited by the minute. Surely it was a good sign that Johnny was able to forgive her so easily and be friendly and happy so soon after they had a fight. After a short pause, she carefully added, "Hey, I'm sorry about the lecture today about the pot. You've got to do your own thing." "That's okay," replied Johnny, quickly annoyed again as he remembered the whole thing. He decided to just end the call before Mindy could do some big emotional number. He hated when girls got all teary and weak. "Hey, well, look, I'll give Doug a call and check you out later, all right?" Mindy felt the sudden icy edge of Johnny's voice slap her. She was confused. What did she do? She was afraid of annoying and losing this handsome, dangerous bad boy. He was an exciting, older man, and she didn't want to act like an immature, unsophisticated college girl and turn him off. She took a deep breath, and trying to sound calm and confident, she answered, "Yeah, sure. Hey, I had a good time today." Before she could stop herself, however, her curiosity made her add, you sound stoned." Her last comment brought Johnny's mind back to the smooth flying he had just done. He laughed dryly. "Yeah, this is some awesome shit, man. I only smoked half a joint, and that was 3 hours ago. I haven't tried to walk yet." As he laughed, Johnny heard a rhythmical knock at the door. 3 soft knocks followed by 2 loud ones. He knew the code. Mindy, listen, there's someone at the door. I gotta go, okay?" He hung up the phone without waiting for Mindy to answer. "Come in," he yelled towards the door. A tall, scruffy teenager with long, dirty-looking blonde hair walked in carrying his skateboard. He was wearing a Korn t-shirt and baggy jeans. He pulled off his baseball cap and sat down in front of Johnny, scratching his head. This is it?" he said, nodding towards the weed-covered table. He looked at Johnny and noticed his bloodshot eyes. With a short snort, he said, "Dude, you're like so wasted." "Yeah," answered Johnny, closing his eyes and leaning back into the couch. "You think you can move 50 of these dime bags?" "Let me try a hit," Dwight said in reply. Johnny opened his eyes and handed Dwight the half-smoked joint that was still in his hand. Dwight fired it up and took a long, deliberate drag. He held the stuff in for as long as he could, and then closed his eyes and blew the smoke toward the ceiling. His head wobbled a little as he exhaled. "Awesome," he said slowly. "You got more after these 50? "I've got enough to rock your whole school, and several other schools as well." Dwight leaned back to enjoy the hit. "Yeah, I've got a cousin over at Pavo Real High. You want him on it?" "Has he ever dealt before?" asked Johnny, opening his eyes just enough to see Dwight. "Just a few joints, but he's good in business, paints cars, and if he screwed up, he knows I'd kick his ass." "Yeah, deal him in. I don't want to sit on this stuff forever." He sat up and started rolling a new joint. Dwight put his cap back on and stood up, grabbing his neon green skateboard. "Done, dude. I'll take this stuff now and go talk to my cousin. Catch you later." Dwight threw the folders Johnny had prepared for him onto his backpack and walked out of the apartment. He dropped his skateboard on the ground as soon as he was out of the door and pushed off. Just a few feet from the apartment, as he approached the corner, a cop car pulled by, turning the corner. The cop looked suspiciously at Dwight. With an innocent and friendly smile, Dwight looked right back at the policeman and gave him the thumbs-up sign. As soon as the car turned the corner, however, his hands made a very different sign. He murmured something under his breath and skateboarded away. Dwight had never had a problem keeping cool under pressure. The suspicious look that the policeman gave him as he carried several packets of marijuana in his backpack did not bother him at all. He thought others could smell fear, and he refused to ever give off that scent. He was sure that as long as he could keep cool, he would be fine. No one was ever going to catch the Dwight master. He applied his philosophy as he sold Johnny's weed at school. He confidently sat at a lunch table, pretending to sketch something in his notebook while other students around him got food and joined and left groups. The cafeteria was incredibly noisy. Students were laughing, talking, and screaming. In a corner, a small group had decided to conduct an improv session of imitating their teachers on top of the table. Students moved their chairs and tables, and the sound of cracking plastic and screeching metal added to the cacophony. In the background, loud punk music played through the cafeteria speakers. The large and muscular PE coach was in charge of keeping order during the lunch hour, and he made a point of walking through all the groups, keeping a close eye on every student. He let them make as much noise as they wanted, as long as they did not get too unruly. Right under the watchful eye of the coach, however, kids would blatantly approach Dwight and casually slip him money. Almost without moving or looking up, Dwight would slip them a small bag of weed in return and hid the money up his sleeve. He was not afraid or worried in the least and looked directly into the coach's eyes with an almost mocking smile. Johnny's bad boy attitude was not the only concern in Mindy's mind before the sorority's party on Saturday. A couple of days before the party, her sorority sisters had seen a very young-looking, very expensively dressed and attractive woman drive up to the sorority house in an expensive red Mercedes 500 SEL. Everyone knew she was Georgia Jones, Mindy's stepmother. Mindy and Nancy were coming out of the house just as Georgia got out of her car and, like she was in a photo shoot, removed her rhinestone sunglasses to look around her. Nancy elbowed Mindy softly and said, "Look, it's your stepmom." Mindy looked up to see Georgia, who had just spotted the two girls, waving frantically with her eyeglasses in her hand. "Great," said Mindy under her breath. She finally got Dad to give her the Mercedes she wanted so much. Now I wonder what she wants here. Why would she ever come here anyways? Georgia had noticed that the girls were not walking towards her and assumed that they had simply not recognized her yet. She continued to wave her sunglasses in the air and, in her strong Southern accent, yelled out across the lawn, "Mindy, darling, over here. It's me, Georgia." Mindy knew she could not pretend to not see Georgia for long, otherwise she would get louder. With a sigh, she rolled her eyes deeply annoyed and pulled Nancy with her as she slowly made her way to Georgia. Seeing the girls walking toward her, Georgia made kissing gestures and screamed out, "Oh, Mindy, come and give your stepmom a kiss." Mindy walked faster to avoid having Georgia embarrass her some more. She gave a slight and quick kiss and then turned to introduce Nancy, mostly to have something to say. "This is my friend Nancy. You know, the one I'm taking skiing with us over spring break." Georgia turned to look at Nancy for the first time. She slowly tapped her sunglasses against her perfect light burgundy nails and looked Nancy up and down, finally speaking with a strongly condescending tone, like she was speaking to a 3-year-old. With a fake smile, Georgia said, "Oh, yes, your parents are from Dallas, aren't they?" Nancy was insulted and annoyed by Georgia's attitude. It was clear that she was not wanted there, and she answered curtly but politely, "Yes, my dad's an ophthalmologist. Anyways, I gotta go." She smiled sympathetically at Mindy and touched her arm caringly. Then she turned and walked back to the house without even looking at Georgia again. Georgia seemed visibly relieved to no longer have Nancy with them. In less than a second, however, she had already forgotten that Nancy ever existed. She turned to Mindy with an exaggerated motherly smile and, trying to sound sweet and caring, said, "Mindy, I have come to take you shopping and to tell you some rather bad news about our ski trip. Your dad and I have made other plans. We have decided to take some time, just the two of us, in Tahiti." Mindy felt like someone had hit her in the stomach with a baseball bat. A dull pain spread all over her body. She was silent for a moment and looked confused, annoyed, angry, and upset all at the same time. She couldn't understand or didn't want to believe what Georgia was telling her. She pointed to the sorority house without turning to look at it and muttered, But I have already told Nancy that we would take her. What am I supposed to say now?" Georgia put on her sunglasses again and sighed, turning her face to the side to show how terribly distressed this made her and how little she appreciated Mindy's complaints. She delicately rubbed her temples with 2 fingers as she told Mindy, "Don't get so upset. You can still bring your friend to the house. Delbert will look after you all, and you can take your friend to the club." Mindy's face, however, still showed disappointment and pain. She was not satisfied with the very reasonable and generous alternative she had been offered. She could almost hear Georgia telling her how generous and reasonable it was. Georgia sighed and tried to make her understand how reasonable it all was. "Look, Mindy, your father and I haven't been away for months, and it was the only time he could get away. He just finished a big acquisition, and he's only got about 10 days. We're going to a private island near where Marlon Brando used to live. We're leaving tomorrow. We just can't take you skiing to Europe next week. Anyway, at least I can take you shopping today." Mindy didn't respond, but simply looked down and nodded. Without saying anything else, she walked to the passenger side of the car and got in like a zombie.
You're listening to Red Corvette, Section 2.
She knew speaking with Georgia was out of the question. She didn't seem to understand or even care about much. She would start to rub her temples like a woman in terrible pain as soon as Mindy spoke seriously about anything. Mindy guessed that by that gesture she was trying to show that she was getting a headache from having to participate in a useless and unnecessarily dramatic conversation. In silence, Georgia drove Mindy to some of the most exclusive boutiques in downtown San Antonio. Through the ride, Mindy sat looking out the window, with her sight lost in the sky. She was trying to fight back tears as the Mercedes sped down the highways. They first stopped in front of a chic boutique that specialized in trendy clothes for teens. Georgia loved shopping, even if it was not for her, and within minutes she had chosen almost a dozen outfits for Mindy. Mindy went through Georgia's choices and picked a few more things out. She took everything into a dressing room and came out looking very satisfied with the first outfit she had assembled. She was wearing tight, low-cut dark blue jeans, faded at her hips, a see-through light turquoise tunic shirt with a tight turquoise tank top underneath, and black platform sandals decorated with glitter. Mindy smiled at herself in the mirror and twirled around. "Well, what do you think?" she asked the salesgirl. "Is it me?" she asked, striking a pose. The salesgirl giggled at Mindy's happiness and happily replied, "Definitely." Georgia gave the girl a cold and annoyed look. Then she looked at Mindy and sighed and rolled her eyes just slightly. "Well," she said slowly, putting out her cigarette, "don't you want something a little more, sophisticated?" Mindy did not even turn to look at Georgia. "Look, I don't want to look sophisticated. I want to look like this. I like this outfit," she replied with a hard edge on her voice. Georgia could always manage to make her feel inferior. She tried hard to not be rude, but almost wanted to use this opportunity to tell her stepmom all she thought about her. Georgia didn't care. She sighed as if bored by Mindy's lack of good taste. "Very well, then." she said, lazily handing her gold credit card to the salesgirl. Mindy went back into the dressing room and chose whatever else she wanted to buy without bothering to model it for Georgia anymore. What's the point? She figured. The ride back to the sorority house was again completely silent. Mindy stared out the window at passing cars the entire way, trying to imagine herself in them having friendly conversations with people who cared. Georgia didn't seem to notice or care. She would use any stops in the road to check on her hair or makeup in the rearview mirror, and she placed a couple of calls on her cell phone to check on her dry cleaning and a manicure appointment. When they stopped before the Alpha Omega Chi house, Mindy opened the door and started to pull out her shopping bags with an almost inaudible, "Thanks." Suddenly, Georgia seemed to remember something and grabbed Mindy's arm. "Wait, Mindy." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "Your father wanted me to give this to you for when we're out of the country. He's sorry that he won't be able to spend spring break with you." Mindy looked down at the money-stuffed envelope Georgia was holding up, and again she felt tears flowing to her eyes like warm pain spilling over. She quickly grabbed the envelope and said under her breath, "Gee, a consolation prize." Reluctantly, she bent down to kiss Georgia and said, "Thanks, Georgia." She grabbed all her shopping bags and, closing the door to the Mercedes, said, "Tell Daddy I love him." Georgia smiled and nodded with a relaxed wave. Seeing her drive away happily, anyone would have guessed that she had just completed a fun, happy shopping trip with Mindy and not delivered her news that broke her heart. While Mindy spent the afternoon shopping with Georgia, Doug and Johnny met at their local gym for a game of racquetball. They played at least once a week and were both advanced players. They were both fit and agile and became competitive and even aggressive during each game. They played only to win and saw every victory as a sign of their worth as men. After over an hour of heated playing, both were drenched in sweat. Johnny had taken his shirt off, and his tanned and muscular body glistened in the white gym lights. He was breathing more heavily than usual and seemed to have to concentrate especially hard to keep his thoughts and attention drifting from the game. Doug was also tired, but he was clearly more coordinated and faster than Johnny. It was obvious Johnny's edge had been dampened by the overuse of marijuana. He hit the ball hard, and Johnny went up for the shot, but just missed it. Frustrated, he threw his racket down and grabbed his head with his hands, clenching his teeth. The jugular veins in his neck were flexed and straining as he held back an angry scream. Doug laughed at his friend's passionate response and said, "Perhaps too much of the evil hair, brother Johnny. You don't ordinarily miss shots like that one." Johnny exhaled loudly and wiped the sweat from his brow. "Yes, brother. That's it. Would you care for a few more samples?" Doug shrugged his shoulders, passively agreeing. He began to play with his racket, trying to balance it on the palm of his hand. Casually, he asked, "So has Mindy sampled any with you?" Johnny was walking towards the ball. "Not yet, but I'm sure she will at the party. She can't be such a little girl. I gave some to a few guys at the firm. The consensus is that it's lethal. I'd like to buy a pound from you." Johnny threw the ball back at Doug, knocking the racket off his hand. "A pound is a bit risky, counselor, isn't it?" Doug grabbed the ball and the towel, and the two of them started walking out of the racquetball cage and headed toward the parking lot. Doug stopped to drink from a water fountain and let the cool water run over his face, invigorating him like a shot of liquid energy. He stood up and shook his head, splashing Johnny with the cold water. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he answered Johnny, "Money is money. It's neither good nor bad. How much?" "1,000, said Johnny without looking at Doug. "Consider it sold," replied Doug. Johnny turned to Doug with a surprised look. "You're not going to question my price?" Doug laughed and patted Johnny on the back as he got his car keys out of his pocket. "Look, I can get 20 for one joint. I figure at 1,000 for a pound, that's almost 450 grams. I'll make it 8,000 plus some stash for myself. Gotta enjoy the goods myself." Doug reached into the glove compartment of his car and pulled out his wallet. He quickly counted $1,000 in crispy new $100 bills and a couple of 50s. "Here, I'll pay you in advance. Just put it in the trunk of my car. You still have the extra key. Make sure you're not being followed, though. And by the way, don't keep it all in the same place. You're way above the maximum for a misdemeanor." Johnny quickly rolled the money Doug gave him and put it in his back pocket. Doug didn't notice, but Johnny's mouth was almost watering as he took the money. To have so much money so quickly and so easily in his hands, this was what he had always dreamed. Trying to look cool, Johnny nodded and walked away, yelling back to Doug, "Don't forget about tomorrow night." Doug looked puzzled for a bit and then lifted up his shoulders in a questioning gesture. Johnny pretended to throw his sweaty t-shirt at him. "The party? Nancy?" Doug smiled mischievously and turned to get into his car. "I won't," he yelled back. Later that night, as promised, Johnny drove by Doug's apartment. He parked his car a few feet from the garage, and after making sure no one was following him, he casually walked to the trunk of the Corvette, carrying a small package. He glanced once more around before opening the trunk and leaving the package inside. No one had seen him. He was sure. Mindy's heart jumped every time the phone rang. Her hand was sweating and her throat got dry as she answered, hoping and waiting to hear Johnny's voice on the other side. She felt a warm rush, like lava boiling inside her lungs whenever it was Johnny who called. She couldn't explain why it made her so happy that he would call, why she felt she had accomplished something wonderful if he sounded happy with her and said he wanted to see her. So she was thrilled when Johnny called to ask her to drive around to make some deliveries with him. She quickly agreed to meet him in half an hour outside a nearby shopping center. As soon as she hung up, she rushed to the closet to pick a sexy outfit Johnny would like. She chose to wear a short emerald green summer dress that showed off her tan. She put on some green eyeliner and mascara and rushed out. The last thing she wanted was to make Johnny wait. Johnny arrived only a couple of minutes after Mindy. He jumped into her car, kissed her quickly and passionately, taking her by surprise like a sudden summer storm, and yelled, "Hit it!" Mindy laughed, throwing her head back and pressed her foot on the gas pedal so that the car screeched out. She looked like a picture of health and youth, with her blonde hair flying in the wind and her white sparkling teeth shining in an extroverted laugh. "Woohoo! I feel like a gangster." Johnny looked at her with an alluring smile on his lips. She was such a pretty and innocent girl. A surge of pride for having her next to him suddenly filled him. He felt filled with happiness and a strong desire to make sure this pretty woman never left him. That she always be this desperately in love with him, almost like a master and a slave. Without taking his eyes off Mindy, he reached inside his tight jean pockets and pulled out a joint. He pushed in the car's cigarette lighter and asked Mindy softly, "Sure you don't want to do one? You'd probably really like it. It'll help you get over your spring vacation blues." He softly caressed Mindy's leg before lighting his joint and taking a deep drag. Smiling, he offered it to Mindy. Mindy's smile faded as she looked first at the joint and then at Johnny. Johnny kept smiling sweetly, holding out the joint and looking at Mindy with imploring eyes. She felt the need to please him again, to keep him happy so that he would always look at her in that adoring way. She had lost the love of her father, but she was determined to get it back with him. He was irresistible, like a bad little boy with a grown man's body. His gaze hypnotized her. "Okay," she replied willingly. "Just one puff." After running a few drop-offs with Johnny, Mindy headed back to school for her afternoon class. It was Friday, and she had European history, her favorite class. For some reason, however, she could not seem to keep her eyes open. She tried very hard to concentrate, looking directly at the teacher and taking careful notes, but it was to no avail. Her eyes were heavy, and she felt deeply drowsy. She felt a warm, inviting dream calling her, and her eyes kept closing into a heavy darkness that surrounded her like luxurious silk sheets. All of a sudden, Mindy felt someone standing over her and clearing his throat. She woke up to realize she had fallen asleep over her book. Her check was stuck to the page. She had sleep marks all over her face, and most embarrassing of all, she had left a good-sized puddle of drool on the book's page. It looked like a lake on the map of Europe. Mindy wiped her face and eyes with a startled motion and blushed a deep crimson red, feeling more embarrassed than she had for years. The angry eyes of the instructor and the mocking and curious eyes of 150 students were all focused on her moment. The few seconds it all lasted felt like years of humiliating misery. "Miss Jones," said the instructor angrily, showing no signs of understanding or pity, "please do your napping somewhere else, not in my class." Mindy couldn't find her voice for a minute. She felt so overwhelmingly embarrassed. She sat with her mouth slightly open and heard several of the students around her snicker and saw a couple of them imitate her dumbfounded look. "I am sorry. No disrespect meant. I swear." The instructor shook his head and turned to walk back up to the front of the class. "If you care to follow along with the rest of the class, we're on page 458. Johnny had agreed to meet Mindy at school after her class to celebrate his success and newfound riches. She couldn't wait until her class was over and she could walk away from the embarrassment like a prisoner walking toward crisp freedom. The second her professor dismissed the class, Mindy grabbed her purse and her backpack and rushed out, heading towards the lawn in the center of the university. It was a grassy square surrounded by desert-pink 2-story buildings and trees on all 4 sides, which provided a welcome shade from the Texan sun. Mindy looked for a shady corner under a large orange tree. For some reason, she was on the verge of tears, but tried to control herself by taking deep breaths, one after the other, in a rhythmical yoga fashion. In a few minutes, she felt a bit more in control of herself, although she was still exhausted. She glanced up and saw Johnny walking towards her with a tall, grungy teenager by his side. Johnny spotted Mindy and gave her a sexy bad boy smile. He looked like a Calvin Klein model with his face covered by a 5 o'clock shadow, his tattered jeans, and his faded blue shirt, which rippled tightly over his muscles. He bent down and grabbed Mindy's face almost brusquely, kissing her with breathtaking ferocity. Then he let go of Mindy's face as suddenly as he had grabbed it and nodded toward Dwight, saying as he sat down next to Mindy, "Hey, babe, this is Dwight. He works for me." Mindy was taken aback by Johnny's sudden affection, as though a sudden gust of fresh wind had swept her to a distant heaven, but she just smiled and extended her hand to Dwight, taking in his young looks. "You work?" she asked, a bit incredulous. Dwight looked as dirty and as careless as usual. He barely touched Mindy's hand before letting himself fall onto the grass next to her. He stretched on his back and looked up at the open blue sky through the orange leaves. He was dressed in his usual, baggy jeans with a black t-shirt that didn't manage to cover his boxers completely. A black baseball cap covered most of his face as he spoke with a surprisingly friendly voice. "It's just a matter of speech. I deal his dope. You look tired. That stuff really gives you the nods, doesn't it?" Johnny looked annoyed at Dwight and quickly cut into the conversation. "Let's not announce it to everybody, okay? I mean, keep it a little bit cool, right, Dwight?" He turned to Mindy and grabbing her hand playfully said, "Hey, I know we're supposed to go to the spa and work out, but I've got to meet a connection, okay? Would you mind if I just see you tonight?" Mindy tenderly reached out to stroke Johnny's hair. "No, it's okay. I'd like to take a nap anyway. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to go to that party. I never knew pot could put you to sleep like that." Johnny simply nodded and remained quiet for a bit. Several students were walking through the lawn in front of them. Johnny followed them with his gaze, and there was a mixture of anger and regret in his eyes. Without noticing, he started nervously tapping his finger on his knee. His mind seemed busy in an unconscious self-inspection. As if disturbed by what he found, he suddenly turned back to Mindy and picked up her last comments. "Yeah, sometimes it lays you out. My car's still in the shop, Mindy. Can you drop us off over at Miracle Pizza? Mindy lifted her eyebrows in surprise. That's in the barrio, mi amigo. Have you forgotten you're white? Dwight was still laying on his back, staring up at the clouds, and he didn't move at all as he answered Mindy's worries. It's okay. My cousins all live there. They'll give us a ride back. He reached into his front pocket and pulled out 2 stocking caps, throwing one of them to Johnny. Besides, with these, they'll think we're homeboys. Do you mind? Johnny asked Mindy, patting her hand. Mindy giggled, looking at the caps. You're gonna wear that? No, it's okay. I'll drop you off, homeboys. Let's go. She got up with a bit of a struggle, feeling very tired still, but happy to be doing something for Johnny. The barrio was a good 40 minutes away from Mindy's university. The drive seemed incredibly short to her. However, as she basked in the light of Johnny's presence, even when he didn't say much to her, she still thought the drive was enjoyable. As they entered into the barrio streets, the atmosphere around them changed. Spanish signs began to appear all around, and Spanish music drifted to them from the shops and restaurants like invisible threads of distant lands. The rich smell of Mexican food also found its way to their noses as they drove through several taco shops. The rich smell of carne asada and spicy chili made their mouths water. When they stopped at a light, Mindy looked out of her window at the driver next to her. He was a young male with a shaved head, wearing a wife-beater sleeveless shirt that revealed his many tattoos. He had a spiderweb running from his jaw down to his chest, with a large tarantula in the back of his neck. He was messing with the air shocks that made the car go up and down in an impressive rhythm. He was driving a low-riding '64 Chevy, painted in luminescent green with white pinstriping. In the back of his car, the figure of a beautiful woman had been carefully painted. She was a mixture of a mermaid and a beautiful Hispanic virgin, dressed only in a thin veil, looking out into the distance sadly. Mindy looked impressed. Right before the light turned, she yelled out in a friendly voice, "Nice car!" And then she pulled out, burning rubber. She was enjoying the trip to this neighborhood, which she had always considered off-limits. As usual, Dwight seemed unimpressed by anything around him. He slouched in the back seat, looking out the window with a spacey look on his face. In a monotone, he told Mindy, "Make the next left and just drop us off." Mindy did as she was told and slowed her car to a stop in front of a small pizza shop. Johnny leaned over and kissed her softly. "Thanks, I'll see you around 7. We'll go out to eat before the party." He grabbed his backpack and got out of the car. Before returning to the campus, Mindy followed his movements with adoring eyes, watching him pull the stocking cap over his dark curls. "Take care of yourself, homeboy," she said with a smile and winked. Johnny winked back and slammed the car door shut. Mindy slowly pulled away, keeping her eyes on Johnny through the rearview mirror. She saw 2 young men wearing hoods that shaded their faces emerge from the building's shadows like specters, approaching Dwight and Johnny with a secret handshake. The 2 young men who approached Johnny and Dwight were Hector and Manuel. They were actually only a bit older than Dwight, but looked much older. Their eyes and their faces seemed to have aged before their time. Although their faces were still young, they somehow looked like 2 old men who had seen much pain and who had survived great suffering. Hector had a shaved head and a large pale scar that crossed his forehead and the side of his nose. He wore a large diamond stud on one ear and had his name tattooed across his hand. Manuel was a bit taller and thinner. He had most of his hair shaved off, except for a patch in the middle, which he had pulled back into a tight ponytail. He had chipped one of his front teeth in a fight. His broken tooth gave him a mean look, and his eyes had a way of freezing anyone they looked at. He had several tattoos over his arms and neck. After greeting Johnny and Dwight with the usual handshake, Hector and Manuel walked silently back to the rear of Piso de Milagro, with Johnny and Dwight following them. They sat down on an abandoned metal picnic table, and Hector turned to Dwight and nodded. Dwight knew exactly what he meant and handed Hector one of Johnny's joints. Manuel took out a lighter and the joint was silently lit. Hector took the first couple of drags and then passed it to Manuel. A few minutes went by before anything was said. The group sat in silence around the picnic table in the middle of a dirty gray lot. There was trash and weeds all around them, and the muffled air conditioning sounds from the pizza restaurant, which almost covered up the traffic noises. They were hidden in a bubble of smoke, which softened the corners of the dark and ugly reality that surrounded them. It was a place without time and without human substance. They were all men who knew the face of death and decided to embrace it. They were joined together by a drug that could liberate them from that knowledge and numb them to the fear of it. It was not a good choice they had made. By refusing to consider the possibilities of a final judgment and a reckoning for their deeds, they had, in fact, already sentenced themselves to an eternity of torment. But for these few minutes while high on marijuana, the implications of their choices eluded them. They were too high to care as they danced with death. Hector had closed his eyes for maximum concentration after taking his drags. He suddenly opened them and smiled. He turned to Johnny and, offering his hand, he said with a nod, "It's bueno, me gusto." Johnny smiled in response, pretending he understood Hector, but whispered to Dwight, "What's he saying?" Dwight nodded. "He likes it." Hector's smile became larger. "I like it," he repeated for Johnny's sake. "I can move a lot of this for you. How much have you got?" "More than enough." He reached into his bag and pulled out a packet which he lightly threw to Hector. "This is 2 pounds. 2,000 for me. Everything over that you keep." Hector grabbed the bag and, putting it under his nose, inhaled its aroma deeply before replying, "When do you need the money?" "No rush. I'll come pick it up in the next week. Can you move it that quickly?" Hector turned to Manuel and smiled, to which Manuel nodded knowingly. "Yep, no problem. Listen, Manny will give you a ride home." Manuel got up and nodded for the two of them to follow. Hector did not get up. Dwight and Johnny nodded and followed Manuel to his car, a midnight blue '64 Chevy with red dragons spitting bullets painted on the sides. Dwight got in the back seat and Johnny climbed into the passenger seat. Manuel pulled out of the pizza shop and got on the road. He turned the car's stereo on, and Cafe Tacuba blasted out at deafening volume. Several minutes went by in silence. It was obvious that as they left the barrio, more and more people turned to look at them with annoyance and fear in their face. A few blocks away from Alpha Omega Chi's house, Manuel pulled up to a stop sign as a police car pulled up next to them. Dwight, still wearing his stocking cap, gave the officer a finger sign and then quickly sunk down into his seat. Johnny flexed his jaw in anger at Dwight's dumb joke and reached behind him to take the joint that Dwight was holding. Without moving his arm, he quickly hid it under his seat. As soon as the cop pulled off, shaking his head, Johnny turned around and slapped Dwight on the back of the head. He was furious, thinking that Dwight's stupid joke could have put them both in danger. Dwight gave Johnny the finger and sulked down on his seat. A few minutes later, they pulled up in front of the sorority house. As they pulled up, Nancy walked by the car, and as she glanced in through the window, she noticed Johnny. With an expression of surprise and disbelief, she stopped and asked, "Johnny, what are you doing with that ridiculous hat?" Johnny didn't answer, but simply pulled the hat over his eyes. Manuel looked past Johnny to Nancy's face, and then, in less than a second, to Nancy's chest. He pulled his hands off the steering wheel, and he pretended to be squeezing a pair of grapefruits as he said, with a lusty smile for Nancy, "Nice chalupas." Nancy looked completely disgusted and angrily turned to Johnny. "Johnny, where'd this guy come from?" "I'm not some kind of bimbo, you know." Johnny jumped in, pulling his hat off. "Yo, cool it, Manny. This is a lady. Turning away from Nancy, he winked to Manuel. He opened the door and stepped out of the car. As he closed the door, he nodded at Manuel and Dwight. Manuel laughed and pulled onto the street with his music blasting even louder. Johnny didn't follow the car with his eyes, but turned his whole attention to Nancy. "Did Doug come by this afternoon?" Nancy started to walk to the house, expecting Johnny to follow her. "No, he just called. I smoked some of that weed of yours. Pretty awesome party stuff. Come into my house. I'm sure Mindy is in." Johnny followed Nancy to the common area of the house and then obeyed her silent command for him to sit and wait there while she went to look for Mindy. Although a quiet girl, Nancy had a way to command respect from those around her. A certain melancholic air surrounded her, giving her a seriousness that others obeyed. Nancy walked into the room she shared with Mindy and heard the shower running. Mindy was taking a shower to try and shake off some of the sleepiness caused by the pot. She stood under the spigot, letting the barely warm water run down all over her body. She could feel the pressure of every drop on her wet skin. Her eyes were closed, and she concentrated on the flowery smell of the shampoo and the soap she had just used, a mixture of passion, fruit, and daisies, trying to force her mind to be alert and awake. Suddenly, she heard the door open and decided steps walk in. Her head jumped with all sorts of fearful thoughts which seemed almost out of her control. Reaching for her towel, she yelled out, "Who's there?" Nancy smiled at Mindy's nervousness. "A friend of yours," she answered mysteriously and headed for Mindy's desk to look for a lighter. Mindy wrapped her light blue towel around herself and walked out of the bathroom into the room to find Nancy lighting a joint. She started taking small puffs while Mindy went through her closet trying to pick out her outfit. "Here," Nancy said, walking towards Mindy's closet. "Have some." Mindy looked annoyed and ignored Nancy, pulling out a brown halter top with gold sequins sprinkled throughout its front. "It's only 4 o'clock. Why should I?" she asked with a frown. Nancy just smiled and leaned against the closet, taking another drag. "Come on, it's the weekend. Time to party hardy. Johnny rolled it for me. He's downstairs." As usual, Mindy's heart jumped as soon as she heard Johnny's name. Suddenly, the joint seemed much more appealing, and she blushed slightly. She reached for the joint from Nancy and took a long drag. It was a party after all, she reasoned, and there was nothing wrong in getting a little relaxed before spending a night dancing with Johnny.
You're listening to Red Corvette, Section 3.
She swayed a bit under the effect of the joint and shook her head. She smiled, thinking of Johnny downstairs as she slipped the halter top over her head and pulled on some very low-cut, hip jeans. She tossed her hair with a bit of mousse and applied some charcoal eyeliner to make her eyes look dark and alluring. In just a few minutes, she was walking down the stairs to a room full of music, colorful lights, and laughter. Several other fraternities and sororities had been invited, and the house was full of young people dressed to impress. Johnny was standing in front of the band waiting for Mindy. As she made her way to him, a good-looking frat boy approached her. He was tall and as tanned as her, with curly golden bronze hair and hazel eyes. He was wearing a tight polo shirt, which showed off his pectoral muscles, achieved through countless hours at the gym doing bench presses. He flexed his pecs as he walked into Mindy's path and said, "So, sweetie, what do you say our houses get together tonight?" Mindy looked surprised and puzzled, but instead of replying, she turned with supplicating eyes to Johnny. Johnny was already walking toward her with large, angry steps. Stepping right in front of the frat boy, between him and Mindy, Johnny gave a menacing smile and said in a low, quiet voice, "Take a hike. She's with me. Unless you want to wear your nose inside out." The frat boy took a couple of steps back in surprise. He was probably as strong as Johnny, but he knew that Johnny was much meaner. His evil look and smile made his threat incredibly believable. "Sure, no problem," said the frat boy, holding his hand up in a mock surrender as he stepped further back and disappeared into the crowd. Mindy pulled Johnny toward her and in a stoned, slurry voice said, "Come on, let's dance." She felt completely uninhibited, feeling almost separated from her body, as though her mind was sleeping while the rest of her was alive and on fire. What her body did seemed to not concern her fully. She could abandon herself to its feelings and desires without feeling her soul involved in it all. She danced like crazy, throwing her head around, kissing Johnny passionately and laughing loudly. She pulled Johnny behind her, and in a few minutes the two of them were leading a long train of people around the party in a conga line. The party went on until around 3 a.m, when a nearby neighbor, sick of the loud thumping, called the cops and complained of loud music and screams. Soon, a patrol car pulled in front of the sorority house and forced the DJ to turn the music off. With the music dead, the party started to slowly dissipate. The crowd left the house in groups, some laughing and talking still, some too drunk to notice that there were cops in the house. Some people were barely able to stand without the help of friends. Every room in the house was littered with what seemed like hundreds of green and brown half-empty bottles and glasses, and the floor was covered with ripped and broken decorations. In the midst of colorful rubble stood Mindy and Johnny, kissing each other goodbye with long romantic kisses. As Johnny pulled away from the last kiss, tenderly running his hands up and down Mindy's back, he said, "So will I see you tomorrow around 11? Mindy reached out for one more kiss. "We will head to my dad's ranch for spring break week. You sure you want to go?" "Okay, kids, enough loving for one night. Get out now," said one of the officers, shining a flashlight on Mindy and Johnny. Ignoring the officer, Johnny kissed Mindy once more and then ran out of the house. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," Johnny called out as he vanished. Johnny was sitting on his couch watching cartoons on TV and eating sour cream and onion chips when Mindy walked into his study. He took a big gulp from a 2-liter bottle of vanilla Coke and did not look up. Mindy was wearing a white tank top with a short flowered skirt, sunglasses, and her hair pulled into a messy bun. Johnny looked less than clean, with 2-day stubble, a grayish old and ripped t-shirt, an old and ripped pair of jeans, his usual cowboy boots, and a metal-studded belt. His hair had obviously not been washed since the night before, and his curls were a matted mess on the back of his head. Annoyed at being ignored, Mindy playfully kicked Johnny's boot and took her sunglasses off. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her skin looked pale and tired. Johnny glanced up from the television and with a mouthful of soda and chips said, "Hi, you're looking good. I'm ready for the trip. I guess Doug is coming too. He wanted to hang with Nancy." Mindy put her sunglasses back on and reached inside her white and pink bag for her keys. Without looking at Johnny, she hesitantly asked, "You're going like that? Isn't it a bit rugged?" Johnny had already turned back to the cartoons on the TV. He took another long gulp of soda before answering with a devilish smile. "Not too bad. Listen, lighten up. We're only going to your parents' house, and they're not even going to be there." He got up and slowly hugged and kissed Mindy to make her forget about her concerns. Mindy could not help but smile. She even liked how his stubble felt against her cheek. He kissed her cheek softly and said, "Come on. I told Doug we would meet him in his apartment so that he could drive his Corvette down with Mindy." In less than an hour, the two couples were driving down flat and long Texan highways. For several hours, the horizon was flat, reddish-brown sand, and a blazing blue sky. Doug enjoyed feeling his Corvette hug each and every curve with silky perfection, and fly over the straight highways like a blazing bullet. He turned on his favorite song, Highway to Hell, as high as the speakers could go, and concentrated on the feeling of the wind rushing against his hair almost madly. Mindy followed in her car close behind the Corvette. As the afternoon set in all around them, the desert glowed in different shades of gold, pink, and maroon, bathing them in a dreamlike light against which a couple of premature afternoon stars shone like bright spots of sunshine against velvet softness. A few miles before coming to the last turn to her parents' ranch, Mindy honked at Doug and signaled for him to pull over at a roadside restaurant for some drinks. She pulled ahead of him and pulled into the parking lot of Mama's barbecue hut. The Corvette followed right behind. Mindy pulled up on an empty spot right by the front entrance, and Doug parked the Corvette next to some imposing truck. As he opened his door to get out of his car, 3 drunken roughnecks came out of the bar. They had seen the Corvette pull into the parking lot and had decided to come out and inspect the driver of such a high and mighty car. Doug pretended not to notice and closed the door, but kept the keys ready in his hand. He briskly walked around the car to grab Nancy's hand as the drunks approached them. All three men were overweight, wearing football jerseys, jeans, cowboy boots, and baseball caps over greasy hair. Doug looked extremely young and preppy standing by them. He also looked taller and more muscular, but three men looked strong and heavy like big bears that could destroy anything in their way in a mean and vicious way. Nancy looked at the men worried, but then quickly looked away, following Doug's example and trying to ignore them. One of the drunks elbowed his friend, who stumbled forward with a can of beer in his hand. He overtly stared at Nancy's body, running through her curves slowly and then licking his lips. With a wad of tobacco in a bulge in his lower lip, he slurred out with a lustful smile. "Hey, mamas, why don't you join us? We could probably show you a better time." He laughed and looked at Doug and Johnny as he said this, insulting both of them with his look. It was clear that he was mocking Doug's and Johnny's manliness, attempting to degrade them like they were little boys. Johnny stepped in front of Doug and Nancy and, holding Mindy's arm firmly, tried to walk past the drunks casually but firmly, saying, "They're with us." The larger of the three men stepped in front of Johnny with a look of disgust in his face. He planted his feet firmly on the ground, decidedly blocking the way and breathing the stench of tobacco and alcohol into Johnny's face as they spit out between his teeth. "Let the ladies decide." Without waiting for Johnny to react, he pushed him back and cornered Mindy against his pickup truck. Mindy tried to keep calm and sound strong and decisive as she looked right back at the man and said in a loud voice, "Why don't you get out of my face? I've got a date, sweetheart. And even if I didn't, I don't think I'd want to dance with you." By this time, the two other men were standing behind the drunk who had pushed Johnny. Doug quickly pushed Nancy back into the car. Two other couples walking out of the restaurant stopped in their tracks, sensing that a fight was coming. Without anyone noticing, as he was pushed back, Johnny had reached under his belt and pulled out a gun from his back. With a flexed jaw and pulsating veins jutting out of his neck and forehead, he rushed back to the men, releasing the gun's lock and, as quick as a cat, pushed the gun roughly against the skull of the man cornering Mindy. Between his teeth, in an icy whisper, he said, "Stop, my friend, unless you want your brains scattered all over your truck. Mindy, get back in the car." Mindy slipped under the drunk's right arm and ran to get into her car. The two other drunks looked at each other, confused and indecisive for a second, but quickly recovered and began advancing towards Johnny slowly. Johnny looked at them with an almost hateful smile and jammed the gun harder into their friend's head, yelling out, "I suggest you hold it too. Nobody needs to get hurt. We'll just be on our way." The shortest and drunkest of the men, who had first stared at Nancy's body, took a last gulp of beer and threw the can against the floor, saying with a fake smile, "We're just having fun, little girl." Johnny cocked the gun as he pushed it into the man's head, feeling the metal press against the hard skull, and replied, "Well, I'd hate to mess up those pretty boots of yours, but if you make a move before we're out of here, that Stetson of yours is going to be minus a hat rack." Violently, he pushed the man's head into the car, which made a dull thumping noise, and took a step back, aiming his gun at the other two men now. "So," he said as he started walking back, "if you got any brains at all between those ears of yours, stay where you are." As Johnny spoke, Doug backed up to the Corvette slowly. As soon as they each reached their car doors, they jumped in and sped out of the parking lot before the roughnecks could react. The three drunken men were fatter and slower, but spurred by anger, they ran to their Dodge 4x4 and pulled out of the parking lot, scraping the side of the truck against the restaurant's lighted billboard on the way out. The short man was driving while the one who had been pushed into the truck by Johnny stuck a rifle out of the window of the car and aimed at the Corvette. He fired twice, but neither shot made it to the car. All three cursed as they watched the taillights of the Corvette fade into the night. Exhausted, the two young couples finally drove into Mindy's parents' ranch another 40 minutes later. Doug whistled as they pulled into a long driveway leading to a huge colonial-style mansion. The house itself was painted a light desert rose, with 5 huge sparkling white pillars in its porch entrance. Small lights illuminated each pillar from the bottom, making the whole house look like a floating dream against the metal blue sky, which was filled with glittering stars like numberless miniature diamonds. A small fountain stood in front of the house, made up by 4 large marble fish which spit water into a large foaming shell held by a nude mermaid. Around the house, a well-kept hedge of fuchsia and bright orange bougainvillea contrasted brilliantly against the wall's pastel rose. Getting out of her car, Mindy very casually said, "We're here." Johnny tried to look nonchalant, but he could not help staring at the house with his mouth wide open for a second. Thankfully, Doug quickly walked up to him and pulled him toward the trunks of the cars to get the luggage. "Come on, man," he said under his breath. They started to unload Mindy's car as Johnny softly whistled in admiration. Nancy was also surprised and impressed. This was the first time she was seeing her friend's house. She had not realized how rich her friend's parents were, although she had always been amazed by how often and how much Mindy went shopping. "Mindy, what does your dad do again?" Nancy asked, dipping her fingers in the refreshingly cool water of the fountain. "What does any good Texan do?" answered Mindy with a sarcastic tone. "Oil, black gold. My daddy has barrels of the stuff." She walked over to Johnny and grabbed his arm. "Why don't you guys just leave those bags there?" "Don't worry, Delbert will put everything away." Johnny looked at her puzzled. "Delbert? Who?" Mindy interrupted him. "He's the ranch manager. Here he comes now." Just as she said that, a man in his mid-40s with a thick build and a mass of dark hair, parted neatly to the side, drove up to them in a golf cart. He was wearing a neat white Western shirt and Wranglers. He waved in a friendly and benevolent way as he approached the group. Except for Mindy, all looked at him with an expression of curiosity and suspicion on their faces. "Hello, Mindy," Delbert exclaimed as he stopped the car next to Mindy and Johnny. "Welcome home. Your dad said to expect you right around this time." He winked and pointed at Doug's car, saying with a laugh, "That car came up the drive so fast I thought it was a missile." Mindy laughed in a relaxed way. "Delbert, these are my friends from San Antonio, Doug, Nancy, and Johnny." Delbert nodded towards each one in turn and then said, "Welcome. Can I fix you all some barbecue? Millie's gone home for the night to tend to her grandchildren." "But I fixed one mean barbecue." Johnny looked incredibly pleased and laughingly almost screamed. "I'd love it." Everyone turned to look at him, Doug with lifted eyebrows, Nancy with a look of embarrassment, feeling obviously uncomfortable at his tactless behavior, and Mindy with an amused but surprised smile. Johnny was acting like a kid in a candy store. He was so happy at having somebody serve him that he didn't understand why everyone was staring at him. "What?" he said, shrugging his shoulders. "I'm starving." Nancy tried to change the topic and pulled Mindy towards the house, saying, "Let's go in. I want to see your whole place." As they walked into the entrance hall, Nancy's eyes widened enormously. Before them was a huge winding marble staircase, illuminated with exquisite hanging chandeliers. The entrance hall was decorated in a southwestern style, with elegant terracotta, sky blue, and sandalwood Navajo rugs. At several angles of the room were huge bronze statues of bulls, horses, large clay pots, and other Western motifs. The back wall had been painted in earth colors to match the decoration. The room was large and airy, but also warm and welcoming, with a strong sense of Southwestern taste and wealth. Johnny walked around the room looking at the decorations and slowly exclaimed, "This room isn't a house, it's a freaking museum." Doug was quietly shaking his head in disbelief. "Unbelievable," he whispered softly to himself. Mindy seemed to not notice her friend's astonishment. She grabbed Johnny by the arm and, like a little girl showing off her toys, said in an excited and chirpy voice, "Let's get high. We've got a neat balcony that overlooks the back 40. It'll be great to get high there." She turned around and started running up the stairs. Johnny, Nancy, and Doug followed her up the stairs, through a small outdoor patio, and up another flight of stairs to a small balcony on the rooftop. She grabbed pillows and blankets from a room on the way up, and the 4 of them made themselves comfortable under the Texas skies. They laid back on a soft layer of pillows and covered themselves with Mindy's velvety blankets as Johnny pulled out a bag of weed and started to expertly roll several joints. The sky had turned a rich purple blue, like a calm ocean after a storm, and several stars of different hues and sizes blinked out from the still navy background. Nancy made herself comfortable, nestling her head against Doug's chest, and started to count how many stars she could see. Her pale skin seemed almost translucent in the calm light of the night, and Doug delicately traced her face's profile with his finger. There was something sad about Nancy's beauty, and Doug was profoundly attracted to this melancholic charm. Johnny finished rolling the joints and lit one. He took a deep drag and then passed it to Mindy. As Mindy took her puff, Johnny laid his head down on her lap. The joint went from person to person in silence. In complete silence, the small group smoked a couple of joints and drifted each into their own thoughts, enjoying the peaceful evening and the warmth of being with their partners. Mindy stroked Johnny's hair as he looked up into the sky. A shooting star flared by, and Mindy smiled in delight as Johnny pointed it out to her. She had taken several deep drags and was feeling completely uninhibited and free to follow her emotions randomly. "You know," she started to tell Johnny, "when I was a little girl, I used to come up here and dream I could fly." Johnny just smiled, but Mindy's mind had started to follow her daydream. She got up, gently pushing Johnny's head out of the way, and walked towards the balcony rail. Her friends watched as Mindy got up on the rail. She smiled and then wavered as she looked down. In a second, Johnny was next to her. He grabbed her hand and softly commanded, "Come on down, Mindy. I don't want you to fall." Mindy laughed lightly, blew Johnny a kiss, and closed her eyes, shaking her head. "I won't fall," she mumbled, brushing her silky hair away from her eyes. "Watch. I really can fly." Johnny did not wait any longer. He rapidly grabbed Mindy by the legs and lifted her off the rail. "Don't be crazy." Nancy sat up nervously, biting her lip anxiously. As Johnny brought Mindy back to the pillows, Nancy said in a tone that was a mixture of maternal concern with bossiness, "You're too wasted, Mindy. You better not smoke anymore." Doug tried to take everyone's attention to something else. He inhaled in a loud, exaggerated way, almost like he had been underwater for minutes and was desperate for some fresh air, and said, "Why don't we go down and see what's up with the barbecue? It smells good from here." He didn't let Nancy reply, but stood up and, making a loud whooshing noise, lifted her up by the waist. Keeping his hands on her waist, he started walking downstairs with Nancy in front of him. Every few steps, he would tickle her to make her laugh. Nancy at first tried to stop and was annoyed, but the tickling attacks were too much, and soon she was running ahead of Doug laughing. Johnny smiled and pulled Mindy up to follow the other two. In the backyard downstairs, Delbert had donned a tall chef's hat and had created quite an impressive barbecue. Plates were piled with hot, glistening sausages, pieces of steak, juicy ribs, and a few roasted pieces of chicken, all dripping juicy flavor. There were also several bottles of sodas, water, and a couple of bottles of fruit juices. Bowls with barbecued beans, cornbread, and some chopped tomatoes also stood ready. Doug's mouth dropped open as he approached the food. Delbert smiled pleasantly and gestured for them to tackle the food. "Just go ahead and dig in. No need for formalities." The boys looked at each other, smiled, and gave each other a high five before heading toward a pile of clean plates. Doug whistled in admiration as he surveyed the honey barbecue chicken wings, and Johnny piled several juicy ribs on his plate, exclaiming, "Right on," as he licked the tangy juice off his fingers. Nancy turned to Mindy, and both girls rolled their eyes in reaction to the boys' childish behavior, but they couldn't help laughing at the same time. Mindy had an open party in her house the next night. College and high school friends showed up, bringing other friends with them. Soon, people filled every room of the house. There were people chatting and laughing around the pool, sitting on the different verandas, dancing inside the house, sliding down the huge banisters. Different music came from each of several rooms, and mixed with voices, laughter, and the sounds of plates, glasses, bottles, and cans to create the lively and exciting sound that accompanies every good party. Every room was filled with activity and color. Nancy rolled her eyes as she walked past a group of young men standing by the pool, daring each other to jump into the pool fully dressed. A tall and skinny man in his early 20s, with a massive head of wild brown curls that almost hid his face, took up the challenge and stepped back. With the other men screaming in support, he took a couple of running steps and somersaulted into the pool, still holding his bottle of beer and yelling out, "Geronimo!" Mindy sat a few feet away from the pool, with 4 sophisticated-looking college students. A red crystal bong was in the middle of her little group and passed from one girl to the next. When the bong was passed to her, Mindy took a long hit and slowly blew out the smoke, whispering, "Wow." The girl to her right, an intellectual-looking girl with very short dark hair, black-framed glasses, and 2 eyebrow piercings, turned to her and asked, "This is great weed. Where'd you get such great stuff?" Mindy smiled smugly, proudly answering, "My boyfriend's a dealer." A red-headed boy sitting across from Mindy overheard her and asked, "Could he set us up with some?" As he was asking this, Johnny approached Mindy from behind and jumped into the conversation. "Did I hear someone asking for more? If anyone's interested, the goods are $250 per ounce. But 2 hits will get you flying." Mindy was smiling, but her head felt horribly heavy, and she let it fall heftily on Johnny's lap as he knelt next to her. He lifted up her head carefully and looked into her face. Her eyes were terribly bloodshot, and her gaze was lost. Johnny frowned and worriedly said, "Mindy, I think you've had enough." Mindy's gaze snapped back into focus momentarily, and she angrily pulled her head away from Johnny's hands. Her face was contorted with anger, and she looked almost disgusted. In a loud and high-pitched voice, she yelled out, "Screw you! You sound like my father." She imitated Johnny with a mocking, high-pitched voice. "Father John of Little House on the Prairie tells me what to do. Just shut up, Johnny. Everyone knows you can't OD on pot." Johnny's mouth twisted in disgust. He pushed Mindy off and walked away. Larry, the red-headed boy who had asked about buying some pot, got up and ran after him, yelling, "Johnny, Johnny, wait! I've got a business deal for you, man." Johnny did not turn around, but he slowed his pace down so that Larry could catch up with him. Mindy couldn't remember what happened after she yelled at Johnny. She took a couple more hits off the bong and found everything people were saying around her very, very funny. When Johnny looked for her a couple of hours later, she had taken off her shoes and was dancing around the pool with a few other silly girls. Slowly, people started to leave the party. Dawn was starting to come by the time people started to leave, the first rays of timid golden pink light glimmering through the sky. The few who had not drunk, and those who had worked through their alcohol by the early morning, were in charge of driving others off. Several people had to be carried into cars as they were too drunk to walk. Johnny walked around the house looking for Mindy and finally found her sleeping face down on one of the pool chairs. He softly shook her shoulder to wake her up. Mindy, come on. It's time to go to bed. Almost everyone has left. It's close to 5 in the morning." A muffled moan came out from under Mindy's matted blonde hair. As Johnny tried to move her hair out of her face, she unconsciously reached out and pushed him away with a soft grunt. Johnny stood up, exasperated. He spotted a towel on another lounge chair and quickly grabbed it, shook it open, and threw it over Mindy's exposed back. He looked at her for one more second and then walked away. Johnny headed into the house and went into one of the upstairs rooms for a nap. Several hours later, he woke up feeling drowsy from the long, hectic night and decided to take a quick, cool shower. On his way to the bathroom, he bumped into Doug, who was just coming out of the shower and looking, as usual, like a GQ model. His hair was neatly combed and his clothes fit him perfectly. He patted Johnny on the back in a friendly manner. "Hey, where's Mindy?" Johnny did not even look at Doug. He kept walking toward the bathroom, giving a big yawn. "She's completely out of it. She's still sleeping by the pool. You're just gonna leave her there, are you?" asked Doug, raising one eyebrow in surprise. "I tried to move her hours ago, but she won't budge." Doug was not satisfied. Firmly, he asked, "What if she wakes up and falls in? She'd probably drown. Let's get her in, come on." Johnny turned and followed Doug without protesting. They walked out onto the pool deck to find the whole area literally filled with empty and half-empty soda cans, plastic glasses, and beer bottles. A radio was still blasting at full volume from a corner table with the lyrics of "Wasted Away in Margaritaville" floating over the mess. They found Mindy in the exact position Johnny had left her in hours ago. She was snoring softly and looked rather peaceful. As Doug got closer, however, he flinched. Her legs, which neither her skirt or the towel had protected, had been exposed to the harsh Texan sun for hours and had turned a bright beet red. "She's burnt to a crisp," Doug said. "Let's get her inside." Johnny grabbed Mindy under her arms and lifted her as he turned her so that her head was facing up. Doug grabbed her under the knees, and between the two of them, she was carried like a dead body upstairs to her room. They unceremoniously dropped her on her king-size poster bed. She landed heavily on her thick and soft baby blue covers and pillows, and rolled aside grumpily. Barely opening one eye, she whispered, "Johnny?" Doug, who was standing closer to her, answered her call. "We brought you in, Mindy. You better get some lotion on your legs. They're pretty badly burnt up." Mindy stretched her hand out to Johnny, who grabbed it and said, "I tried to move you earlier, but you just wouldn't let me near you." Mindy grabbed her head, trying to pull several strands of hair which had stuck to her face away, and rubbed her eyes, trying to wake herself up fully. Her makeup was smeared all around her eyes in a bluish-black mess. She slowly sat up and tried to smile apologetically. "I'm sorry. And I didn't tell you guys, but I made plans with a friend to take us all balloon riding later. Where's Nancy?" Doug reached out to help Mindy sit up, and with marked interest in his voice said, "Nancy? Sleeping in. What time's your friend showing up?" Johnny, on the other hand, looked distracted and annoyed. "I don't know about the balloon. I've got to meet Larry. Business." As Mindy sat up, she felt the skin on the back of her legs pull and burn like it was being torn apart by some terrible claws. She tenderly touched the back of one of her calves. Her skin was almost a fluorescent pink. Wherever her fingers pressed, a white print was left for several seconds. The burning was intense and sharp. It stung so sharply her eyes filled with tears. All of a sudden, all she could think about was taking a cool shower and covering her legs with soothing, cool aloe lotion. "Ouch!" she exclaimed painfully, and looking back at Doug and Johnny, she murmured, "Maybe I better not go." Johnny lifted his eyebrows quizzically. "You don't want to go up in the balloon?" he asked Mindy. "Don't worry about me. I can go to the meeting myself." Mindy shook her head to say no while she turned around slowly, trying, without much success, to use her legs as little as possible to get up. "I've been up a dozen times, Johnny. Doug, you guys can drive my daddy's Range Rover. I'd love to take your vet and give Johnny a ride if you let me." Doug shrugged his shoulders in agreement and went to wake Nancy up. Johnny turned to Mindy in surprise. "You want to go with me? I've got about 10 pounds in the truck." Mindy started undressing and answered, sounding a little annoyed. "Don't you just want to leave them here? Why can't he pick up the stuff here rather than having you drive around with all of it?" "He wants it dropped off," answered Johnny lazily, letting himself fall on Mindy's bed. "How much?" asked Mindy, wrapping a towel around herself. "All 10 pounds, $25,000, a good wad of cash." "Hey, Mindy, is he good for the money?" "Larry?" asked Mindy, turning back to look at Johnny as she left to take a shower. "Yeah, his family makes us look like paupers." Johnny put his hand under his head and laid on Mindy's bed, thinking about the world of people like Mindy and Larry, a world of huge houses, large cars, pools, and kids who took it all for granted. "Soon, I'll have just as much." Everybody took showers, got ready, and then the group had a light lunch, courtesy of Delbert's talents in the kitchen, before heading out. It was after 2 in the afternoon before Doug and Nancy headed out. As they walked towards Mindy's dad's Range Rover, Doug suddenly remembered something and started fishing in his pant pockets for his keys. Nancy looked mystified and asked, "I thought we were going in Mindy's car. So why do you need your keys?" Doug looked satisfied as he found his keys, and he quickly kissed Nancy and started to run back to the house. As he ran back, he answered Nancy. "We are taking the Rover, Nancy, but I told Mindy that she and Johnny could use my car." Wait just a minute and I'll be right back. As Doug answered the house door, Nancy yelled back to him. Aren't you afraid she'll mess up your car? She's doing way too many drugs. Johnny and Mindy were about to come out of the door at that moment, and they both heard Nancy's comment. Mindy's face flushed red in anger and shock. She rushed out of the house and yelled back, filled with indignation. Nancy, how could you talk like that behind my back? Because I smoke pot, I'm turning into a drug addict? Johnny reached out to grab Mindy, afraid that she would pounce on Nancy. Mindy tried to laugh everything off, but it was obvious that she was hurt and upset. Nancy simply rolled her eyes and hinted at what she thought, saying, Well? This time, Johnny could not stop Mindy. She walked right up to Nancy's face and in a catty tone snapped, Funny of you to say anything. Since we've been roommates, I've seen you drink your share of 7 and 7s. Nancy snapped right back in the same bitchy tone. Yes, I drink, but you get so freaking stoned you pass out. It's not safe.
You're listening to Red Corvette, Section 4.
Johnny jumped in, trying to calm the girls before a catfight started. Come on, Nancy. You know it's just good pot. You get a really bad buzz. Doug knew Johnny could not stop the girls simply by talking, so he just pulled Nancy back and started to walk away. Nancy did not resist, but she kept her gaze steady on Mindy, even as Doug in a friendly tone called out to her. Look, Mindy, just be careful with my car. I'll be careful with yours. We'll see you two at Rockin' Reds later, okay? Johnny kept Mindy still with one arm while he waved goodbye to Nancy and Doug with the other. Yeah, you two have fun in the balloon. Doug and Nancy drove out for about an hour to the spot where the balloon was hooked to the ground. It was an amazing sight, a huge flat lot of red Texan earth, bordered in the horizon by green and gold farms and, much farther into the distance, small purplish red mountain peaks. The rich red of the earth contrasted wonderfully with the sparkling gold and fresh green of the farm fields. In the midst of all this stood a stupendous hot air balloon, lifting high into a perfectly clear blue sky, straining against the ropes that tied it to the ground like a live animal, desperate to escape captivity and take flight. The balloon was made up of bright purple, green, white, and electric blue sheets, woven together in an intricate star pattern. The fire, spurting ferociously over the passenger basket, added to the feeling that the balloon was alive and anxious to leave the ground. Doug and Nancy got out of the car and were warmly greeted by Randy and Julie, Mindy's friends who were expert balloonists. They were a friendly couple who had graduated from college just a semester earlier and had known Mindy for years. Doug and Nancy liked them immediately, and the four of them had a blast going up and floating above the clouds. Randy entertained everyone with his quirky humor, which usually included impersonations of several cartoon characters and gangster types speaking to each other. After a couple of hours, however, they had to head down. Randy turned to the group, and looking sad about their flight coming to an end, he said, We're going to be heading down. It looks like it'll be getting dark soon. Nancy's sight was lost in the few clouds that had appeared, which were a shade of golden peach. I could stay up here forever. It's so beautiful. Her voice trailed off. Doug looked more relaxed than he ever did. He took a deep breath and quietly answered Nancy's statement. I've never done anything like this, he said. It's just breathtaking. Under Randy's careful guidance, the balloon slowly descended towards the field where a 4x4 was waiting. Once they had safely landed, Doug helped Randy pack up. While they were packing and Julie was preparing the car, Randy turned to Nancy and said, Go into the trunk, would ya? And take out the cooler, please. Nancy obediently headed to the car and pulled out the cooler. She opened it and was surprised to find a bottle of fine champagne and 4 long champagne glasses. With a smile, she walked back to Randy and Julie. She held up the glasses into the air, where they shone in the last rays of sunlight, as she said, Nice, very nice. What's this for? Randy looked at Julie. Tell him, Julie, he said with a wink. Julie pulled over the balloon basket and said, It's your first time out. It's a tradition. Come on. Pop it, Doug. Doug walked over to Nancy and took the champagne from her. Without much effort, he popped the bottle and a jet of champagne spilled lightly over the side. Nancy laughed and started passing out the glasses. The night passed away in friendly toasts and lots of laughter. While Nancy and Doug were sipping champagne and telling jokes next to the deflated balloon, Johnny and Mindy were following Larry's directions to several dropping points. They drove through several poorly lit, impoverished neighborhoods, trying hard to keep their sense of direction. By late evening, Johnny had been lulled to sleep by the rocking motion of the car on unpaved streets. He sat slumped on his seat with a pile of cash on his lap, the payment for an earlier job. Mindy was also feeling drowsy. They had both smoked a couple of joints as they started their drive, and the after effects of the buzz were catching up with her. She didn't notice that for just a fraction of a second she closed her eyes and fell asleep. In that instant, the car swerved violently to the right. Mindy hit her head hard against her window, and both she and Johnny woke up with a start. Quickly, Mindy slammed the brakes and brought the car back into control to the middle of the narrow dirt road. Startled, Johnny yelled out, "What the? Mindy! Watch where you're going! Don't you even know where you're going?" Mindy's heart was still racing from their close call. She was annoyed at Johnny for blaming her instead of trying to calm her down. She did not answer, but simply put her hand in a stop-it gesture. They drove in silence for a few more minutes, and then she pointed ahead to the left. He said to drop the last packet off in an old trailer behind an abandoned Phillips 66 station. That looks like one ahead. It was a dark area where only the station was lit. All the roads around the station were almost completely dark. Mindy and Johnny couldn't see that on the dirt path that ran next to the station, 2 young Mexican-American teenagers were riding tandem on an old bicycle. They had a boombox tied to the handlebars blasting away old Santana tracks. Pepe, a skinny boy of about 14, was wearing a thin t-shirt which showed how skinny he was, oversized shorts, pulled-up white socks, white shoes, and a hairnet, and was pedaling the bike while his friend Jose, who looked about the same age but had on a red Chicago Bulls t-shirt and a piercing on his ear, was sitting on the rear basket. Playfully, Jose yelled out orders to Pepe. "Come on, hermano, ándale. Let's get home before your papa beats your behind." Pepe just ignored him and kept cycling at the same speed. "Not me. You just want to taste my mama's chalupas. That's why you're hurrying me along while your lazy butt just sits there." Jose laughed. He tapped Pepe on the back and pointed to the right. "Here, turn here. Let's take the shortcut." Just as the boys turned right onto the dirt path behind the station, Mindy turned into the station and accelerated a little, wanting to just get the last drop-off over with. She never saw the bicycle, but she felt a thump as the front left side of the Corvette hit the boys. There was an instant loud scream along with the horrible sound of metal bending and twisting, and she saw the shadow of something flying off into the road. As if in slow motion, the loud and deafening sound of the boys hitting the ground came next. It was a sound she would remember forever. A feeling of dread passed over her, and she knew the life was knocked out of the 2 teenagers. She brought the car to a desperate stop by slamming on the brakes, and just sat there for a second, nearly in shock. She had her foot smashed into the brake, her eyes were wide open in terror at what she had done, and a scream was lodged in her throat. She was too afraid, too shocked, too disgusted and terrified to scream. Her face lost all its color, and she realized life would never again be the same. What had started out as a harmless recreational use of drugs had led to a gruesome and terrible tragedy. Johnny reacted much faster. He reached over and pulled the keys out of the engine to stop the car where they were. He opened his door and ran out to see what had happened. Mindy followed him in silence. She had heard a muffled scream when the car hit the bicycle, but now everything was dead quiet. They approached the place where they had heard the bicycle fall. Mindy came up to the body of one of the boys with his head twisted around his neck at an odd angle and blood trickling out of his mouth. His eyes were wide open and staring into a distant point, far in space. Feeling nauseous, Mindy stepped backwards quickly and whispered, "Johnny, "This one's dead." Johnny was next to Pepe's body, which was lying on his side, facing away from Johnny. Johnny did not bend down, but simply kicked some dirt right by the boy's head. Small pebbles landed on the boy's head, but he did not stir. Johnny took a deep breath. "Shit, Mindy, you killed both of them." Mindy could not take her eyes off the boy by her feet, although she felt close to fainting. Her stomach was burning cold. She felt nauseous and lightheaded, and a strange noise filled her ears. In a barely audible whisper, she said, "Should we call an ambulance?" In a loud and angry voice, Johnny replied, "We still got 10 fucking pounds of pot in the car. We can't call a freaking ambulance. This is Texas. We'll be in a Texas prison forever. Or they'll fry us to death. That's one barbecue I don't want to go to. We've got to hit the road." Mindy turned to him wide-eyed. "What if they're not dead? What if there's something the doctors can do? We can't just leave them, Johnny." Fine. We'll make an anonymous call. But I'm not staying. Let's get the hell out of here before somebody shows up." He turned to Doug's car and ran his hand over the front of it, trying to find any dents or blood that could give them away. He stood up quickly and reached out for the keys. "Here, Mindy, give me the keys." Mindy meekly handed the keys over. Johnny quickly got into the driver's seat and signaled for Mindy to get in. She glanced back at the boys. She could almost swear that the one Johnny had stood by was breathing. Guilt and uncertainty filled every inch of her skin, and she was drenched in cold sweat. Johnny was starting to cuss in the car to get her to hurry. Torn between dropping to the ground and crying in agony and the fear of being killed for what she had done, she got into the car like a zombie. Johnny pulled away from the scene even before Mindy had closed her door. They drove in silence for a few minutes until Johnny spotted a public phone. Mindy was surprised that she could not cry. Her eyes remained dry while she felt her heart beating so hard that she put both her hands on her chest, afraid that her chest would break. Johnny drove up to the phone and, without turning the car off, stopped next to it. He got out and ran to the booth and dialed 911. As soon as he heard a voice on the other side, he quickly cut in. "Yeah, I need to report an accident. Route 43, behind the Phillips 66 station. You'll need an ambulance." As soon as Johnny got out of the car, tears flooded to Mindy's eyes. She suddenly became terrified that someone was chasing them, that someone knew what they had done. She got out of the car and ran to the booth after Johnny. She gently knocked on the booth's glass, with tears running down her pale face and a look of desperation. "Come on, Johnny," she whispered, looking like a horror movie character, her hair stuck to her face with sweat and tears turning her skin red and swollen. Johnny looked at Mindy with hatred in his eyes and yelled out, "Shut up!" then cussed silently and struck the booth's glass wall as he realized that the 911 operator had heard him. He put his hand over the receiver, closed his eyes, and took several deep breaths, trying to calm the electricity and hate that he felt flowing through his veins. The 911 operator heard Johnny's yells, but simply continued asking a series of questions in a most professional voice. Typing information into her computer, she asked, "What is your name, please?" Johnny took his hand off the receiver and, trying his best to sound calmer, replied, "Look, I'd rather not get involved. Listen, just send someone out there quick." He did not wait for an answer, but quickly slammed the phone down and stood there for a second, panting. He ran his hand through his hair, moist with sweat, and continued trying to take deep breaths. Looking much older and meaner than he had just a few minutes earlier, he turned and ran back to the car where Mindy sat sobbing. The 911 operator turned to the sergeant on duty and said, "Possible 211 hit and run. Looks like the suspect just phoned in from the mobile station on Alamo Street. Any tape on them?" "Yes." "Log it. Send it to the evidence room." Johnny silently guided the car a few blocks away from the phone without turning on the lights and then pulled over on the side of the road. They sat in silence for a few minutes and then saw the lights of 2 ambulances and 3 black and white police cars before they heard the deafening din of their sirens. Johnny had gotten his cool back and looked without any concern at the emergency cars as they whizzed by. 1, 2, 5 cars? They sure do take policing seriously around here, he said to himself. Mindy could not stop sobbing. How can you be so smug? She said with her voice breaking mid-sentence. She reached under her seat and pulled out a fistful of money. She shook it in front of Johnny, sobbing. Is this all that matters to you anymore? I've never known anyone so callous. 2 little boys. Johnny turned brusquely to face Mindy and said with an icy voice, Well, you're lucky I'm so calloused. I look after myself and I'm looking after you too. You should be thankful. It wasn't intentional. It was an accident. It was an accident. Mindy's back shook as she sobbed and covered her face with her hands. You're stoned, Mindy. Look, is there another place around here we can leave your friend's pot? Mindy quieted her sobs for a second to think. We can leave it in the back of the Red Rocker. Larry's cousin runs the place and lives behind it. Okay, let's call him. But you can't let him hear that you've been crying, so calm down now. Tell him we had an accident, and we're at Red Rockers now. Without waiting for an answer, Johnny turned the car on and started driving to Red Rockers. They stopped at the gas station next to the bar. Johnny turned off the car and turned and looked at Mindy with raised eyebrows. She silently understood that she had to get out of the car and go make the call. She walked to the phone booth, pulled out a couple of quarters, and dropped them into the slot. Behind her, a lighted sign on the window of the gas station shop shone brightly. Say no to drugs. Larry was sitting on a hot tub next to a well-tanned and toned blonde girl. She giggled as Larry played with her hair, tickling her neck and chest with a loose strand. Slowly, Larry approached her for a kiss. Just as he was about to kiss her, however, his cell phone went off with the song I'm Too Sexy as the ringtone. Without moving from the girl's side, Larry grabbed the phone. Yeah? He said as he continued to blow softly on the girl's neck and smile mischievously. Mindy's sad voice came across the line. Larry? Yeah, what's up? We couldn't leave it where you wanted. There were complications. We're leaving it behind Red Rockers in the trash bin next to your cousin's trailer. You better get down here fast. I'm not responsible for it. She hung up the phone, barely holding her tears back. She was no longer just terribly upset. Now she was also fuming mad that all of this had happened. It seemed unbelievably unfair. Why? Why her? As promised, they put the bag with the merchandise in the garbage bin of the trailer park. Johnny parked the car under one of the few light posts in the trailer park. Walking back from dropping the bag off, he stopped and looked at the car closely for the first time. He ran his hand along the front of the car and cussed under his breath. Mindy? He called out. There's a tear in his vinyl. Mindy was no longer tearful. She was deadly pale and strangely calm as she coldly thought about what had happened, what she had done, and what she could do now. She got out of her seat and went over next to Johnny. Bending over next to Johnny, she simply said, It's not bad. There's an auto place right down the street, open 24 hours. Let's get some vinyl patch. We're supposed to meet them in about 20 minutes, replied Johnny, still looking at the car's vinyl. Mindy coldly walked back to the passenger seat and started fixing her hair and makeup in the side mirror as she answered, The stuff dries quickly. I've used it before on small tears. Johnny nodded. They did not say anything else about the accident to each other for the rest of the night. They barely spoke to each other, as a matter of fact. Mindy, for once, was lost deep within the universe of her own thoughts and feelings in which Johnny did not rule. Memories of the 10 Commandments, Thou shalt not kill, echoed in her brain. She knew instinctively that Johnny was bad for her, and she wondered how she let herself get trapped in his orbit. Like a bright star being sucked into a black hole, a hole from which there was no escape. Her thoughts kept shifting between the scene of the boys lying on the dirt and several possible scenes of what her future could hold. Terrible jail terms, the death sentence, humiliation for her parents, constant guilt and lies, Johnny's hatred. Johnny, on the other hand, was also lost, but he was lost in an underworld of dark, hateful thoughts, thoughts of revenge and deceit, Thoughts that prepared him to do whatever was necessary to save himself and fulfill his desires, no matter whom he had to hurt along the way. Paramedics and policemen inundated the accident scene all night. The boys' bodies were carefully lifted from the scene and taken by the forensics team to run autopsies all night. Photographs of every inch of the ground were taken, and locals of the area were called and questioned. The case was assigned to Detective Simon Ortega, who found out about it at 8 in the morning the next day, as soon as he walked into his office. Ortega wasted no time in driving up to the scene of the crime, wanting to see with his own eyes what had happened and where. He pulled his car next to the yellow warning tape blocking off the accident area. His eyes immediately went to the red bicycle, which had been left as it was found the previous night. A team of specialists was to come in that morning to take some more pictures of it, hoping that the bright light of the white-hot Texan sun would reveal any hidden clues. Simon Ortega was a fit Hispanic man in his mid-40s. He was a strong and serious officer with short, straight black hair combed slightly back. His face was very masculine, with a strong jaw framed by a salt and pepper shadow. A large and square nose dominated his face, giving him an authoritative look. He had a nice smile, but people seldom saw it. He was known throughout the force as an intense and somber man. He took his work seriously because his work was his life. Dressed in black pants and a light blue collar shirt with the sleeves rolled up, he leaned against his city-issued white Ford, studying the scene of the crime silently. His eyes lingered on a dark brownish spot next to the bike, which had hours before been the warm wine-red blood of a young man staining the dirt as he slowly bled to death. A patrolman, Officer Mendez, was standing a few feet from Ortega, quietly waiting to answer any questions the detective might have. Ortega pointed to the patch of dirt that was darkened by dried stains. "This is where you found the first boy?" he asked in a cold and matter-of-fact voice. "Yes, sir. The bike was there and the other body was over there," answered the young officer, pointing a few feet away from the stains to a spot next to some small pebbles. Ortega looked annoyed. He kneeled to get a closer look at the ground. "You know, so many people have walked around here. The tire tracks and footprints are destroyed." Officer Mendez shook his head quickly. "No, Detective. Since the ambulance driver took the bodies away last night, not a single soul has set foot here. Someone has been posted here every minute to make sure of that. I took the first shift from 9 to midnight, and then now from 7 to 10. And the call, what time was it made?" 8:15 at night, sir." Ortega nodded and lifted the tape, carefully walking toward the wrecked bike. He concentrated his eyes on the ground with a fierce and piercing look. Without looking up, he asked Mendez, "Any of the ambulance drivers women?" "No, both male, late 20s. Why?" Ortega pointed to the mark of a small female shoe. "Let's get an impression of this one." Ortega found several other clues at the scene that morning. He searched every inch with minute care, seeming unaware of the scorching sun which was relentlessly climbing the sky, becoming larger and fiercer by the minute. When he finally felt satisfied, he nodded to the officer in duty and drove back in silence to his office. On his way there, he carefully played out possible scenarios of what had happened the night before. He arrived to his office 20 minutes later and headed to the lab to look at the results of the autopsies. As he walked by the front desk, however, Officer Joan Metcalf stopped him. "Excuse me, Detective. I just wanted to let you know that there is someone waiting for you in your office." Ortega did a 180-degree turn to head towards his office, politely and seriously thanking Metcalf as he did so. He could see that several people were in his office as he approached it. Through the glass window, several heads could be seen, and the sound of loud male voices and women crying could be heard from several feet away. As Ortega opened the door, a middle-aged woman was yelling at the captain, who had been waiting for Detective Ortega with the family. "What do you mean you have nobody? What do you mean? My boy is dead. Don't you understand? He is dead. He didn't just fall off his bike. Why don't you want to help us? Don't you care? Ay, Dios mío." The captain had his hands raised and was trying to remain calm, and to calm everyone around him. He was not doing a very good job on either account. However, as he looked frustrated and tired while several people around him were talking at the same time, crying and posing questions to him in an offended tone. A family of 8 was standing around Ortega's desk. Several older males, a grandmother, several sisters, and a mother, the woman who had been yelling as Ortega came in, had arrived to the station 2 hours ago and had refused to leave until they saw the detective in charge of the investigation. Ortega broke through the noise with his strong, confident voice, which sounded full of authority. His voice made it clear that he was not a person to be messed with or pushed around. Making eye contact with all those present, he said, "You're not going to solve anything by camping out in my office. We have a definite lead, some hard evidence." The father of one of the boys jumped up from his seat with a strange look of joy, anger, and sadness all crossing his tanned face at once. He was a large and strong man, evidently used to physical labor, with strong and calloused hands and a face creased and brown by entire days of working under the strong southwestern sun. "Do you know who killed my boy?" he said, putting his hands down on Ortega's desk. "Do you people even care? Maybe if my boy was white, then you would care." Ortega looked straight into the man's eyes to make sure he listened carefully and understood the whole meaning of what he was about to say. "It doesn't matter what color your boy was. Whoever did it, we're going to nail them." After saying this, Ortega walked to his office door, opened it, and politely but firmly gestured for the family to leave. "Now please leave. You are interfering with police business." The sisters looked around confusedly until one of them decided to take the lead and step out. The father nodded and gestured for the rest of the family to do the same. He grabbed his wife by the arm to help her out. As she walked by Ortega, however, she paused with deep pain and anger in her voice, tears streaming down her dark brown eyes, and shaking hands. She said in the deep voice of a mother in pain, "You find the monster that ran over my boy." Her husband pulled her away, and her older son rushed to embrace her as she left Ortega's office. Ortega closed the door behind them and walked to his desk. Without a second's pause, he logged into his computer and opened the list of possible witnesses to call. As Ortega dialed his first possible informants, the police investigation continued at full speed. The bicycle had been removed from the crime scene and brought back to the police lab for tests. A technician, wearing a lab coat and wired-framed glasses, bent carefully over the bicycle and scraped several paint samples. He studied the metal inch by inch with a powerful magnifying glass. In the rear sprocket, he noticed a minute portion of bright red paint and carefully scraped it off, placing it in a small, clear cellophane envelope. Neither Johnny nor Mindy had spoken at all about the accident after she called Larry. The small group had spent the rest of the night and the following day casually resting and lounging by the pool, but it was obvious to Nancy and Doug that something had happened. They both attributed it to some sort of love fight between Mindy and Johnny, however, so they did not worry much about it. At the end of the day, tired and a bit bored, everyone sat around watching television. Doug, who had taken control of the remote, was addicted to channel surfing and kept switching between stations. For a couple of minutes, he stopped on the local news, just as the newscaster said, "No new developments on the hit and run that killed Pepe Santoro. His cousin, Jose Garcia, is still in critical condition and is expected to undergo spinal surgery later this week. The family is still looking for donations to pay for this surgery. Silent Witness has offered a reward of $5,000 for any information on the hit-and-run accident, Highway 323. The class action suit against the San Angelo city government." As Doug changed channels, he shook his head, saying, "Pretty damn heartless running down 2 kids and leaving them there. What a lowlife." Mindy felt intensely uncomfortable, sensing that she was blushing brightly and that her whole body was suddenly covered in cold sweat. Trying to act casual, she got up and asked, "Hey guys, you want another beer?" Nancy lifted her eyes up to Mindy and then curled up next to Doug. "No, not me. I don't want to be a drunk." Doug looked at Nancy like she was a little girl. "Would you two just put up a truce, please? You've been at each other's throats since we've been here." "Yeah, lighten up, Nancy." Johnny joined in. Okay. Sorry, Mindy. I guess I'm being a bit bitchy." She reached out and grabbed a handful of pretzels from a large bowl on the center table. Mindy didn't respond. She was restless and wanted to get out, to think and make everyone think about something else. "You guys want to go to Larry's polo game?" "Sure, I'd love to," Doug answered as the phone rang. Johnny, who was sitting closest to it, extended his arm and grabbed it. "Hello? Oh, Mindy? Yeah, she's right here. Just a second." He held the phone out to Mindy. Mindy grabbed the phone and blushed slightly as she heard the voice on the other side. She turned away from her friends and answered. "Daddy? Yeah, that's a friend of mine from college. Yeah, we're having a great time. I wish you were here, though." Mindy's father sat by a large pool in the shape of a teardrop, made up of glimmering blue and white tiles, surrounded by large flower pots brimming with white, yellow, and blue daisies. Behind him, a turquoise ocean softly and rhythmically kissed the peach silky sand as each wave broke upon the beach. The sky was light blue, light enough to be almost white, giving the whole scene a sense of heavenly peace and lightness, which made one feel he had escaped gravity and time. It was a beautiful place, far from the daily life of Texas.
You're listening to Red Corvette, Section 5.
Mindy's dad enjoyed the balmy, warm ocean breeze as he spoke to his daughter. "Sorry about our ski trip, honey. Did Georgia give you that envelope?" "It's okay. Yeah, Daddy. Thanks." "Well, you get yourself something special with it. I'll be back next week, and I'll come down to your college and take you to dinner, okay?" "Sure, Daddy. Thank you. Yeah, I understand you have to go. I love you. Bye." Mindy hung up the phone, swallowed hard, and turned to her waiting friend like nothing had happened. "So, are we going to Larry's game?" The polo grounds were a spectacular sight, perfectly manicured and bordered by well-kept shrub hedges. A small crowd of well-dressed people were watching the match. They all seemed to have bleached white perfect smiles and tanning bed gorgeous tans. Larry was ferociously riding his horse when they arrived. He took to this game, like all his games, almost too seriously. Dressed in a blue and white striped polo shirt, which made his hair look even more red and wild than it usually did, he pushed his horse to its limits. With his mallet in the air, he defiantly ran towards another horse. For several seconds, he viciously grappled with another rider for control of the ball, finally getting off a reverse shot. Looking up at the other rider with wild eyes, Larry shouted, "You were supposed to yield right of way. Both of our horses could have been hurt." The other rider looked at Larry with a mixture of fear and annoyance. He backed his horse away, murmuring, "Yeah, sorry." Mindy pulled on Johnny's sleeve as they witnessed Larry's shouting episode. "Larry's pretty crazy. It looks like he wants to kill that guy on the other team." "Yeah, it does," answered Johnny absent-mindedly. "Look, since we're here, let's go over and see if everything was okay with the drop-off." As they turned to walk towards Larry, however, they found their way blocked by a well-dressed, plump brunette who was smiling at Mindy like she was her long-lost daughter, whom she hadn't seen for years. She was wearing an obviously expensive cream silk blouse and a flowered skirt, neither of which hid her round figure. Her hair was tied into a sophisticated bun on the top of her head. Her face, smiling and plump, was rather pretty, with a pointed little nose and sparkling blue eyes. Mindy, darling," said Mrs. Hampton, reaching over to fake kiss Mindy on both cheeks. "I heard you were coming back for spring break. Simply dreadful what happened last night, isn't it?" "What do you mean?" asked Mindy innocently. "Surely you know. The young boy that was killed. What was his name? Oh, yes, Pepe. Why, his father has been the foreman over at Texas United for the last 25 years. He was his youngest. The funeral is tomorrow. Maybe you should come since your dad won't be able to make it. Don't you remember Ronaldo Santoro? He's the one that put out the big oil fire about 10 years back. Saved your dad's company." Mindy had turned pale while Mrs. Hampton spoke. She was leaning heavily on Johnny's arm and trying hard to look normal. Johnny noticed Mindy's discomfort, but he was not troubled at all. He looked and acted as though the story being told had nothing to do with him at all. Softly, Mindy replied to Mrs. Hampton, "Sure, I guess I'll go. Where's it going to be held?" "At the Coventry Funeral Home, dear." Mrs. Hampton noticed Johnny for the first time then, as Mindy leaned in on him. Her eyes slowly took in his ripped jeans and uncombed hair. As she asked Mindy with a fake smile on her lips, "So who is your young fellow, dear?" A look of disgust spread all over her face, betrayed her true feelings. Mindy looked up at Johnny with a smile. "This is Johnny Dobbs, my boyfriend from San Antonio." In his polite manner, Johnny stood up straighter and extended his hand towards Mrs. Hampton, saying in a deep, mature voice, "Nice to meet you, Miss." Mrs. Hampton stretched her hand out to Johnny like she was afraid of some terribly contagious disease. In a shrill voice, she completed Johnny's sentence, "Priscilla Hampton." With a silly, girly laughter, she added, "But my friends just call me Scylla." "How about silly?" replied Johnny, laughing at his own joke. Mrs. Hampton's face turned a dark shade of purple, and it was obvious that she felt offended. Huffing, she turned to walk away, saying over her shoulder, "Well, you two, I've got to go check on my pony." Mindy waved goodbye to her with a friendly smile. As soon as Mrs. Hampton was out of sight, however, she turned to look at Johnny with a frown. "Why do you have to offend everyone?" Johnny lifted his eyebrows, pretending to be offended that someone would question his innocence. "Me? Did you see how she looked at me? Like God died and appointed her to the position? The lady must eat starch. Look, if these people can't take a joke..." He shrugged his shoulders. Mindy didn't know how to reply to Johnny. Still. "Anyways, you're not really thinking of going to the funeral, are you?" "I've got to." Johnny shook his head, annoyed. He stood in front of Mindy and, grabbing her by the arm, said, "Look, you don't have to do anything. The farther away you stay, the better." Mindy looked away in silence, ignoring Johnny, refusing to agree. Several feet behind Johnny, she saw Larry handing his pony over to a stable hand. She loosened herself from Johnny's grasp and walked towards Larry. She approached him without saying anything, and he nodded for her to walk with him. He waited until they were out of people's earshot to quietly say, "I saw the news. Was that the complication? The hit and run at the drop site?" Mindy kept walking with her eyes on the ground. "Yeah," she replied. Larry shook his head, looking annoyed, and then laughed, mocking Mindy. "What did you do? Get in a hurry and waste a kid? For crying..." Johnny caught with them and heard Larry's comments. Without letting him finish, he interrupted. "Look, it's not how they make it out. The bike came out of nowhere. We drove right over to a phone and called 911. Larry did not answer. He kept walking towards the clubhouse and simply said in an emotionless business tone, "I got the stuff fine. I'm flying to Chicago. They'll love it there. I'd like to get more. How much you got altogether?" Johnny responded in the same heartless business voice. "I've got about 50 pounds more." Larry cut him off. "Well, just sit on it. I'll come up with the money." He stopped and turned to Mindy. "And you better cover your butt. In case you don't know, hit-and-run homicide is playing way, way in left field." A glimmer of thoughtfulness suddenly passed through Larry's eyes. A very subtle smile slipped through his lips, but he almost immediately repressed it and looked at Johnny again with wild, powerful, and dangerous eyes. "Look," he said with an arrogant air of superiority, "I'm probably the only one who could figure things out, so I'd like to get the next load for a special price of $800 a pound." With a fake friendly smile, he softly punched Johnny on the shoulder and asked, "No problem, right? We'll just keep our little secret between us." He stepped back and looked at Johnny and Mindy with a smile. Confidently, he turned and walked to the club, whistling, "I'm Too Sexy," to himself. Ortega had not stopped working since he was assigned to the investigation. He had spent most of the night going through evidence and trying to locate all the people that usually lived, walked, or drove through that area of the accident. He only managed to keep up this hectic schedule by drinking gallons of coffee every day. And every day, regardless of how late he had stayed up the night before, he was in the boxing ring at 5 a.m., hitting, punching, training to kill with his fists, trying to work through the pain and the aggression he felt, the frustration of facing death and violence every day. After at least an hour of high-energy exercise, he would shower, shave, and dress, always looking sharp and clean as he walked into the office with a large espresso in his hand. Ortega had already been in his office for a couple of hours when Officer Metcalf knocked on his door. Ortega didn't look up from the computer printout he was reading, but waved for Metcalf to come in. Metcalf was holding a FedEx envelope. "The carrier was just here for you," she said, handing the envelope over. "Oh, thanks," replied Ortega, marking the spot on the papers where he was stopping and finally looking up at Metcalf. He rubbed his eyes tiredly and said, "I'm going to the kid's funeral later on. You want to go?" Metcalf smiled sarcastically. "Our first date to a funeral. Very creative." Ortega was too busy opening the envelope to catch Metcalf's humor, and he had already stopped looking at her. Distractedly, he answered, "Okay, so afterwards we'll catch a bite." Metcalf looked at Ortega's dark, troubled eyes going over the documents in the envelope. "Sure, I'll go. What time?" 7:30. I'll pick you up." The document in Ortega's hand was the lab report from the victim's bicycle. He read it twice over. FBI Crime Lab, Spectral Analysis. Specimen, red lacquer. Data manufacturer, 1985 to present. Vehicle used on, GM. Ortega threw the envelope on his desk, saying to himself, "Well, that narrows it down to about 7 million cars." Metcalf smiled sympathetically and left his office. Miles away from Metcalf and Ortega, Mindy's mind was also on the funeral that would soon take place. She had laid out a long black dress on her bed, with a moderately low-cut front and long sleeves. Under the dress, there was an envelope she had carefully thought about and prepared. As she sat in front of her mirror in her light pink fluffy bathrobe, thoughtfully towel-drying her hair, she heard a soft knock on the door. Before she could answer, Johnny stuck his head in and with his best handsome bad boy smile asked, "Wanna get high?" For the first time, Mindy rolled her eyes at Johnny and turned away from him. She looked into her mirror and answered, "No, I don't think it would be appropriate." Johnny walked into her room silently and saw the dress on the bed. He walked towards it and slowly ran his hand over the soft, silky material. In an angry and annoyed voice, almost like he was speaking to himself, without turning to Mindy but keeping his eyes on her dress, he said, "You're going, aren't you? You just can't stay away." Mindy turned around blushing in anger. Her face was scarlet red, her brow was furrowed, and her chest was heaving up and down sharply as she breathed deeply in anger. How could Johnny be so insensitive, so uncaring? And to be mad at her for trying to do the right thing? In an angry, sharp voice that wanted no sympathy, she answered Johnny, "Yes, damn it. I killed the kid, and the least I can do is go to his funeral. Not everyone has as easy of a time burying his conscience as you seem to." Johnny turned towards her with an evil, sarcastic smile across his face. In a disgusted, mocking tone, he spit into Mindy's face, speaking to her like she was a complete naive idiot. "You killed a Mexican beaner. Do you think anyone will even miss him? How many kids do you think they had? 10? 8? Frickin' 12? They have a lot, so when a few of them die off, they still have plenty left." Mindy turned away in disgust. She quickly grabbed her dress and the envelope and walked into her dressing room. Johnny kept talking, loudly enough for her to hear through the door. "Isn't that right? How many Mexican people do you see with an only child? It's a rare commodity. They just breed half of them for welfare." Mindy walked out of her dressing room fuming mad. The angry red of her face stood out even more against the black dress she was now wearing. She walked to her huge floor-to-ceiling vanity mirror and grabbed a hairbrush. Brushing her hair, she responded, without looking at Johnny and with repugnance in her voice. "You're really pathetic. What really disturbs me is that you probably believe the filth you are spewing out. It's always the Mexicans this, the blacks that, whatever. You think that because you're white, you're better than everybody? So your dad lost his research job to a Guatemalan. poor baby. It doesn't give you the right to hate everyone south of the border. Anyways, I'm going and I don't care what you think. I can't undo what I've done. But at least I'm going to be there when they have the service for the kid. And then afterwards, I'm going to the hospital and I'm going to use some of my trust money to pay the hospital bills of the other kid. You don't have to come. You can stay right here. But don't you dare tell me not to go, because I'm going. She turned and stared at Johnny. He stood dumbfounded, not knowing how to respond. She had never stood up to him like this. Before he could come out of his shock, Mindy pushed her way past him and out of the room. She left the house flustered and upset. As she walked to her car, she ran into Doug, polishing his beloved Corvette. Seeing Mindy's somber and adult black dress, Doug did a double take. "Where are you going? A funeral or something?" Mindy didn't even notice Doug's attempt at humor. She looked up and with great seriousness answered, "Yes, a young boy whose dad works for my father died, and I'm going to his funeral." Doug stopped polishing his car and stood up, looking closely at Mindy. He could tell she had been crying. "You look pretty upset," he said softly. "You want me to drive you?" Mindy shook her head slowly. "No, thanks. I'll be back in a little while." She walked to her car and got in. She pulled out of the driveway in one smooth turn and waved goodbye to Doug with a sad expression on her face. She drove the whole way to the church without music. Her mind was completely blank, but she felt a dark heaviness oppressing her from head to toe. She was in so much pain she could not even cry. She was trying desperately to be strong and adult, to think about other ways to help the family. What else could she do to get rid of this terrible, suffocating guilt? Despite her best efforts, however, suddenly she could only think about what the boy's mother and father must have felt when they found out the news. She pictured them looking at the body of their child as it lay lifeless on the road, covered in dust, bathed in sticky, shiny, fresh blood. She felt a horrible, wet coldness descend upon her, like the giant tongue of a deadly snake, wrapping itself all around her body. Every inch of her skin, of her being, of her soul felt exposed and dirty. She had committed the most heinous crime. Mindy arrived at the mortuary chapel just as everyone was walking in. She parked, took several deep breaths, and walked out trying to blend in with the crowd. Her ghostly paleness and expressionless face made her look more than a little out of place amongst the emotional, tearful Mexican-American family that filled every corner. Detective Ortega was straightening his tie in the hallway mirror next to Officer Metcalf as Mindy walked in. He saw her as she came in and walked over to the guest register. He remained still and followed her movements with his eyes. Mindy's blonde hair contrasted strikingly with the glossy black hair of the family and friends present. Metcalf noticed Ortega's eyes following something. "What's so strange?" she asked. Ortega nodded towards Mindy. "Just wondering why she's here." Mindy looked around and saw a small woman sitting by the casket. Her face was drenched in tears and crumpled in the most terrifying expression of agony. Her dark brown eyes, which must have been quite romantic at other times, were almost swollen shut from her unstoppable tears. Her heartbreaking cry was almost silent. She quietly whimpered against her husband's chest, exhausted from hours of sobbing and screaming in pain. Her hair was matted against her damp forehead, and her long, elegant brown hands were nervously wringing a handkerchief over and over. She looked like a young girl, terribly hurt and unable to understand why such unbearable pain was cutting through her soul. Her husband's eyes were also red and tear-streamed. He slumped forward, looking exhausted, as if the pain had devoured his energy and strength. He hadn't been able to sleep since he found out about his son's death, and he felt closer to death himself with every passing second of torment. Almost like a robot, he stroked his wife's back rhythmically. His hands and arms were covered with large reddish-brown burn scars, and as soon as she saw them, Mindy's mind recalled Mrs. Hampton's words about the big fire in her dad's company, how this courageous man had saved everything. Mindy stood frozen, looking at the tragic couple with the crumpled envelope in her hands. She grew more pale as she witnessed the bloody reality of their pain. Her skin turned a shade of yellowish green, and she felt her stomach drop into nothingness. She didn't even notice Ortega's eyes following her every move, noticing every expression on her face. She took a deep breath and, trying to muster up courage, slowly walked up to the boy's parents. Looking at them with quiet anguish on her face, she extended a trembling hand to them, holding the envelope she had so carefully prepared. She knew that if she did not act that second, she might lose her courage, lose her strength, and break into tears, screaming to be forgiven or killed. Her guilt and pain were so heavy she desperately wished she could just die, just suffer terribly to pay for what she had done. Before her tears betrayed her, she quickly launched into the speech she had mentally repeated to herself 1,000 times as she prepared the envelope. Forcing herself to look at Pepe's mom, she said, "I'm so sorry about your boy. I'm Mindy Jones. Your husband works for my father. I'd like you to have this to help with the funeral expenses. I'm sure little Pepe will be missed." Hot tears rushed to her eyes before she could finish the last sentence. They burned Mindy's face as she turned to Pepe's father. "You're Ronaldo, aren't you? You saved my dad's company from a large oil fire. I'm very sorry about your son." Ronaldo looked completely taken by surprise at Mindy's gesture. Shocked, he sat frozen for a second, looking at the light blonde girl's face covered in tears. Reacting quickly out of his surprise, he gratefully took the envelope and held onto Mindy's hand. Mindy could feel his large, warm, and calloused hand completely surround her own small, soft, and sweaty palm, which trembled with guilt. Ronaldo swallowed hard once, twice, but still his voice broke in mid-sentence as he said to Mindy, "Thank you so much for coming. I haven't seen you since you were a little baby. I visited your house after the fire. Your father is a fine man, and I see that he has raised a fine daughter." Ortega approached the small group as Ronaldo was speaking. Ronaldo and Mindy suddenly became aware of his presence as in a deep voice close by Mindy's side, he said, "I can assure you, Mr. Santoro, we will find whoever is responsible for what happened to your son." He turned his icy eyes on Mindy for a second before continuing. Mindy felt a desperate need to escape his terrible eyes, but she could do nothing. She had to stand there feeling his look searing her from the inside out. "Excuse me," Ortega continued. "I don't believe we have ever met. I'm Detective Ortega." Mindy's heart skipped a beat and she suddenly found her legs becoming as soft as pudding beneath her. She involuntarily blushed, but she tried to quickly compose herself and answered, as professionally as she could, My name is Mindy Jones." Ortega shook her hand, noticing that it was sweaty and trembling just lightly. Ronaldo noticed Mindy's nervous awkwardness and felt obliged to defend this young girl who had been so kind to his family. He thought that Mindy might feel uncomfortable because she did not know anyone in the room, and that the detective could not possibly know why Mindy was there. Trying to explain all of this, he quickly said, "I've worked with Mindy's father for the past 25 years. He will remember me." Mindy turned to Ronaldo and with a kind smile interrupted him to say, "Well, my father's out of town and couldn't make it to the funeral. I'm sure he would have liked to have been here for you." Ortega seemed unmoved by Mindy's words. He stood unfazed by Mindy's tears or her trembling. His eyes were intent on her face, and he seemed more interested in her than in anything that was happening around them. In a cold, professional voice, which, however, betrayed his intense interest, he casually asked, "You live here in town? I haven't seen you around." Mindy turned to face him directly and tried to look casual and friendly with a soft, girly smile, but she could hear her heart nervously beating as she answered. She was annoyed at the aggressive way in which he asked questions that on the surface seemed so casual and unimportant. Wiping her tears with the back of her hand, she answered, "Oh, I was away at prep schools for a while, and now I'm in second year at San Antonio State. I'm just here with some friends over spring break." As she said this, she felt that she could no longer stand Ortega's piercing stare. She felt increasingly uncomfortable and vulnerable. She suddenly noticed how out of place she was at the funeral, how she stood out against the grieving family and friends. Quickly, she turned to Pepe's parents and politely said, Excuse me, I really must be going." Ortega, unable to find a reason to stop her, was forced to let her pass, but his body language and face showed that he was reluctant to do so. Metcalf, who had seen the entire episode from a few feet away, walked over to Ortega and simply said, "A little pushy, aren't you?" Ortega did not respond to Metcalf's veiled criticism. His eyes followed Mindy carefully as she walked out of the funeral parlor. Only once she had disappeared from his line of sight did he turn to Metcalf. He justified his strange and aggressive behavior by saying, "I just find it odd that she's here. You never know about someone's conscience. I wonder if she has a red—" Without finishing his sentence, he rushed out to the parking lot, but Mindy had already driven away. Doug continued to work on his car after Mindy left to go to the funeral. He was completely involved in every curve and glimmer of the Corvette, bending over to carefully wax every square inch, to polish every angle. Delbert walked up to the garage as Doug cleaned the Corvette's headlights. He smiled, seeing Doug's youthful face concentrated so deeply on the state of his car. He saw Doug as a young man, full of energy and dreams, young enough in his heart to still be able to fall in love so deeply with a car. Hearing Delbert's footsteps, Doug looked up. In a friendly and fatherly way, Delbert smiled and said, "You keep your car in nice shape." He pointed to the bra on the front of the car and asked, "What do you call these things?" Doug pushed his hair back to inspect his waxing job. He softly ran his hand over the car's bra, replying, "Bras. They're to protect against flying rock and road hazards. It saves me repainting this car all the time. This thing cost me half of my first year's salary right out of law school." Delbert approached the car and patted the bra. His hand ran right over the rip caused by the accident, but he didn't notice. He had come out here to speak to Doug about Mindy, and so he carefully asked, Do you by any chance know what's been eating Mindy? She's like a different person all of a sudden. Is she having trouble with that Johnny fellow?" Doug had looked unconcerned and returned to carefully polishing his car. Bent over the hood, he said, "I think she's mad at her dad for leaving with her stepmom and forgetting her this spring. I wouldn't worry. She'll get over it." Delbert nodded and looked at Doug for a moment. Doug's calmness did not comfort him. He felt that Mindy was in some sort of trouble, but he could not figure out what kind of trouble it was. He patted the car's bra one more time and started to walk away, saying, "I'm going into the kitchen. Can I bring you out a brew?" Doug looked up with a smile. "Yeah, thanks. I'd love one." Mindy pulled into the driveway just a second after Delbert had entered the house. She parked the Range Rover and waved at Doug as she opened her door. Doug waved back with the waxing cloth he was using in his hand. "Where's Johnny?" Mindy asked. "He's out on your three-wheeler. He said he would be back before dark." Mindy nodded and walked towards the house. As she opened the door, she ran into Nancy, who was coming down the stairs in her bathing suit, ready to enjoy the warm afternoon water. As soon as she saw Mindy, however, Nancy stopped dead in her tracks. Mindy was white as spirit and looked almost sick. Nancy looked at her friend's face and saw that her eyes were red and looked old and tired. Stepping close to Mindy, Nancy asked in a gentle but worried tone, "What's wrong, Mindy? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mindy shook her head and sighed, trying to rid herself of all the fear, stress, and remorse she felt. She felt physically ill from all of her nervousness. Her body wanted to go to sleep. In a low voice that sounded exhausted and defeated, Mindy replied, "Nothing. Funerals are hard. They remind me of my mom dying. Every time I go to one, I expect to look in the casket and see my mother's face. It's hard." Nancy looked serious and uncomfortable. She did not know how to reply to Mindy's pain, so she said the first thing that came to her head. "Well, why not get high and forget about it?" Mindy didn't answer. She just walked past Nancy with her head down. She stopped at the foot of the stairs and sighed again. "Some things you can't forget, even when you're high. I'm gonna go get out of these clothes. I'll meet you by the pool, and tonight we'll go into town for Mexican food." A few miles away from Mindy, Johnny was enjoying the rugged Texan landscape on the three-wheeler. He rode it fast, enjoying the jolt it took as it went over small hills and rocks, and took sharp turns to feel the thrill of almost losing control. He was not aware of the interesting plants around him, or of the beauty of a sky so clear and light that it was almost white. Johnny was just interested in the emotion of riding the three-wheeler faster and faster, coming closer to falling, to hurting himself, only to get back on balance at the last possible second. All of a sudden, however, he slammed on the brakes of the three-wheeler and stopped as if the world was coming to an end before him. Several feet away from where he sat, he could see an unmarked Ford and a plain-clothed man leaning against it. The man had been looking the other way as Johnny drove up, but he had turned towards Johnny when he heard the screeching brakes. He looked at Johnny for only a second and then turned away again, as if he was not interested in the least. He had a cigarette in his hand and took a long, peaceful drag as he looked over the horizon. As if hell was chasing him, Johnny turned the three-wheeler around and sped toward the house. A few seconds later, the man walked to an irrigation pipe and turned it on. Johnny, however, did not know what the man was doing there, but he wanted to be ready for the worst. He parked the three-wheeler in the garage and approached Doug, who was finishing his long waxing process. Doug was concentrating on making the rims of his car sparkle, and he did not look up as Johnny approached. Johnny pretended to be calm as he leaned against Doug's car and said, "Doug, this house is under surveillance." Doug looked up quickly. "For what? You don't have any left, do ya?" Johnny shook his head. "No, just personal stash." Satisfied with Johnny's answer, Doug turned his attention back to the car's rims without another thought. "Look, don't sweat it, Johnny. They can't come in here without a warrant. And what probable cause do they have to get a warrant? You tell me. Screw them. They're not going to find anything here. Maybe that dude you sold it to was hot. Anyway, all you got is the money, so don't sweat it." Johnny didn't answer. He softly kicked the Corvette's wheel as if to check it, and then silently walked to the house. Johnny could not have known that just as Doug told him to calm down, real danger was descending upon him. As Johnny walked back into the house, Larry's plane landed in Chicago O'Hare Airport. Larry quickly made his way out of business class, carelessly cutting in front of two senior citizens on wheelchairs. He rushed to the baggage claim area and waited eagerly for the luggage to start flopping down the conveyor belt. He glanced around a couple of times nervously. He had both his hands inside the pockets of his light black windbreaker, and he could not stop cracking the knuckles of his thumbs over and over as he counted the passing seconds. What seemed like an eternity went by before he saw his navy blue duffel bag come out of the chute. All his attention concentrated on the bag. As it approached him, he quickly reached down to grab it and was surprised to feel someone grab his hand at the same time. Larry looked up to see the stern face of a tall, muscular, and tanned Filipino man. In a swift move, the marshal reached behind himself, grabbed his handcuffs, and slapped them on Larry, who stood frozen in shock.
You're listening to Red Corvette, Section 6.
Larry's surprise was such that he was still holding onto his bag with all his strength. The marshal was not fazed by Larry's shock. In a serious voice that made it clear that his request was actually a command, he said, "Would you come this way, please?" Larry suddenly came to his senses and dropped the bag he was holding. Trying to look innocently confused, he stammered, "What for? That wasn't even my bag." The marshal's face remained as expressionless as a stone. He ignored Larry's feigned innocence and started automatically reciting, "You have the right to remain silent. Everything that you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one, then the court will appoint one for you." Larry sighed and capitulated. Almost passively, he let himself be dragged behind the marshal and his assistants as they pushed their way through the noisy and curious crowd. At the security checkpoint, the marshals flashed their badges and were waved through. Larry kept his face down, blushing in shame and rage. Larry was taken to a holding cell in the airport where all his belongings were searched. A plain-clothed detective entered the cell and began interrogating him. After a few minutes, however, it was clear that the interrogation was not going anywhere. Larry refused to answer any questions and kept saying he was innocent, even as all the evidence pointed to his guilt. The frustrated detective passed the room and said, "Now I think we need to go through all this again. We have your bag, which was checked in at Dallas, full of pot. About 10 pounds, give or take a few ounces. That's interstate transportation of an illegal drug. You could get 7 to 15 years. Joliet State Prison. You might have heard of it." Larry looked at the ceiling in exasperation. 2 hours of interrogation were about to break his resolve. He sighed loudly and slowly replied, "No, I don't know the prison, but look, I might be willing to make a deal." Cautious, not wanting to look too eager, the detective did not move from where he was standing, but slowly pulled out and lit a cigarette. "Yeah?" he asked, taking his first puff. "What are we talking about?" Larry was now looking intently at the detective. He felt a cold knot in his stomach as he played his trump card and betrayed his friend. "I know something the police want to find out. About a murder." The detective leisurely blew out the cigarette smoke and answered Larry's intense stare with his own intense gaze. "Well," he replied slowly, "just withholding information can make you an accessory." Larry jumped in before the detective could finish. "Listen, if I withhold what I know, the people will walk off scot-free. Are you willing to make the deal or not?" "Well, we can't." Larry slammed his hand on the table. "Cut the crap. You can make any deal you want with the federal prosecutor and judge. I know how it works. One hand washes the other. I don't want to do time, not here. I want 1 year max and minimum security. Lompoc, Safford, one of the cushy places. I want—" Now it was the detective who interrupted Larry with fake laughter, which he used to make himself appear in control. "Before you get too choosy, how do we know what we're getting?" Larry knew he had him. "Call the police chief in San Angelo. Ask him if they found that hit-and-run killer." It was a matter of hours before everything was arranged between the Illinois and Texas authorities. When Ortega and Metcalf walked into the station that evening, the officer in turn at the front desk shouted to Ortega, "Hey, Simon, the chief wants to see you right away." With his usual seriousness, Ortega nodded to Metcalf and walked directly to the chief's office. The door was open, but Ortega stopped at the door and knocked. The chief, a stocky man in his mid-60s, looked up and as he saw Ortega, motioned him to a chair. The chief always looked upset, and this was no exception. With a furrowed brow, he said to Ortega, "We've got a break. You know Larry Fishburne?" "Road contractor?" Ortega replied quickly. He was familiar with all the big families in town. "Yeah, that's the father. The junior. He was busted in Chicago, over 10 pounds in dope. He wants to sing on the hit and run. Grab the first flight. We don't want to miss a note. I told the feds it was real important." Ortega was already on his feet. As he walked to the door, thinking about his next move, he asked, "How'd they nail him?" The chief was already going back to other papers on his desk. "The new dope-smelling dogs at the airport. They nailed him picking up his bag. He's scared and wants to deal. You need a ride?" Ortega shook his head. "Okay if I have Metcalf drop me off?" The chief suddenly looked down at his desk, remembering something. He grabbed an envelope and handed it to Ortega. "I've already got the ticket, and here's some petty cash. You'll be booked at Piedmont downtown. Bring back some good news, will ya? This racial thing on the hit and run isn't sitting good with the mayor." Ortega just nodded with a thoughtful look. There was no one who wanted to get whoever hit those 2 boys more than him. Away from the quickly developing drama, Mindy's spring break was coming to an end. They had spent the last morning packing all their things up and loading them into the Corvette. Everyone except Mindy had said goodbye to Delbert, and they were all ready to go. Doug and Nancy sat in the front seat of the Corvette, smiling as Mindy gave Delbert one last hug. Johnny, on the other hand, slouched in the back seat, like a little boy having a tantrum. Delbert kissed Mindy's forehead and then turned to the car. "It was great to have you all. Don't be strangers. Come back and visit." Johnny mockingly snorted as Delbert waved them off and sarcastically replied under his breath, "Yeah, we love it in Hicksville." Nancy turned to look at Johnny with a look of disgust and annoyance on her face. Trying to keep her voice low so that Delbert wouldn't hear, she hissed at Johnny. "How can you be so ungrateful? Really, Johnny?" Doug tried to cover up for Johnny by turning and waving out the window with a large, warm smile. "Adios, Delbert. Thanks for all the great barbecue." For almost an hour, they drove in silence as the evening settled on the Texan highways. The red Corvette sped along like a flame, almost gliding on the pavement. Doug felt in such control of the car that he swerved and passed other cars in the most dangerous ways, always trusting the machine to respond to his split-second reactions. Right before coming to a blind corner, he sped past a monstrous semi-truck at twice the legal speed. Infuriated, the semi honked its tremendous horn. Johnny simply smiled and gave the driver the finger as he was left far behind. A few miles down the road, they passed a different truck, this one full of farm workers. The tired men looked at the glistening red devil as it whizzed past them, leaving only a trail of hot air behind it. They soon came to a small hick town where the road was much smaller. For once, Doug slowed down a bit. A sign on their right read, "San Antonio, 35 miles. Reading the sign, Nancy turned to Doug with a dreamy look and asked, "What's the first thing you're going to do when you get back, Doug?" "Call my office and see if I still have a job." Nancy and Mindy laughed at Doug's joke, and even Johnny smiled as he imagined his friend phoning the office in fear. Johnny's thoughts soon turned to something else, which widened his smile far more. As if talking to himself, he said, "I'm going to unload the rest of my weed and buy a Porsche." Ortega did not waste any time getting to Chicago. As soon as he landed, he took a cab to the police department. His cowboy boots stood out slightly as he walked into the department and asked the clerk at the reception desk for the interrogation room. Barely looking up to check Ortega's badge, the clerk pointed up the stairs. Thanking the man politely, Ortega headed up the stairs and then down a long hallway. At the end of it, a glass door was marked Interrogation Room. He opened the door without knocking. Sitting in a plain oak chair was Larry Fishburne, Jr., with 2 officers standing by. Ortega immediately took control of the situation. He walked up to Larry and extended his hand. "Larry, pleased to meet you." One of the officers, Sergeant McCarthy, an Irish-American officer who had been in the force for over 20 years, seemed a bit taken aback by Ortega's forceful attitude. He nodded his greeting to Ortega while sizing him up. The other officer, a thin and tall and much younger Polish-American man, quickly approached Ortega to greet him. Ortega turned to him and shook his hand. "Simon Ortega." "Michael Pulaski, sir." The older officer gave in and walked toward Ortega as well. "Brian McCarthy. Nice to meet you, Detective Ortega. Are you familiar with our suspect?" Ortega turned to look at Larry intently. He quietly nodded and replied, "I knew his older brother. They built half of the highways in Texas." Larry smiled, feeling the power of having someone in the room who knew how important and influential his family was. "Been a while, huh?" he asked Ortega. Ortega ignored Larry's attempt at friendliness. In a cold, professional voice, he told him, "Look, before I came over, I talked with the feds who made the collar. You barely had enough marijuana for them to bother with. So if we make a deal, the charges will be knocked down to a misdemeanor, and we'll transfer the jurisdiction to San Angelo. You can bond out while waiting for trial. In fact, you can fly back with me, handcuffed, of course. You better have the goods. I've just flown 5 hours. It's 3 a.m. and I'd rather be in bed." Larry's voice changed. He took on a cold business demeanor and answered, "Look, as far as I can gather, the hit and run was on Route 327, right by the old Phillips 66 station. Wasn't it?" Ortega did not blink. "Yeah, why? Were you there?" Larry's nerves suddenly failed him. He knew he was betraying friends. Nervously, he continued, "No, damn it, I wasn't there. But I know who probably was. At least I've got a good suspicion." Ortega did not seem convinced. "How do you know if you weren't there?" Larry tried to act confident and calm again. He took a long puff of the cigarette he was holding, as though he might never have another one, and then slowly blew a smoke ring. He looked at Ortega knowingly and confessed, "It was my drop sight, man." Ortega interrupted, "So you were there?" Larry jumped back in, afraid to be blamed for all of it. No, listen. The people who were supposed to drop my dope there after I paid for it called me before 9 p.m. and said something had come up. That they couldn't drop it off there. He paused, watching Ortega's reaction. Ortega's face did not give away anything. After waiting a couple of seconds, he calmly asked, "Yeah? Well, who are they?" Larry became very nervous again. He stretched forward towards Ortega and almost begged with his eyes as he looked for a promise. "Listen, man, this is for sure that we're going back. Next flight." Ortega reached into his coat pocket and quietly placed 2 plane tickets in front of Larry. "Good as gold." Larry took a deep breath. He looked at the floor for a second and then quickly looked at Ortega again. He rushed to get the words out of his mouth before he would lose his nerve. "You know Duke Jones? It was his daughter, Mindy. Her and one of her doper friends. That's who I scored from." Ortega's face remained motionless, but his voice betrayed the anger he felt. "Shit. His company employs half the people in town. Did you see her friend's car?" Larry closed his eyes. "Yeah, a Red Vet." Ortega quietly began to pace the room. He stopped and approached Larry. Looking straight into his eyes, he asked, "You'd be willing to testify in court that they were going to make a drop there?" Larry felt ill. He didn't realize it, but he was disgusted by his own weakness. He was betraying a friend to avoid trouble. He nodded. It was too late to go back. "Yeah, no problem." Ortega stood up and addressed the officers. "You can tell your office we're going back to San Angelo." Larry felt a wave of relief wash over him. His sense of liberation was tainted, however, by the cold sweat of guilt he felt drench his soul. Larry's guilt lasted far less than the new feeling of freedom, however. As soon as the plane lifted from Chicago, Ortega dozed off in his seat. A few minutes later, the stewardess made her first round, offering passengers some coffee. A tall brunette, with a smile that could have been part of a toothpaste commercial, approached Larry kindly and started to ask, "Would you like cream?" As she did this, however, Larry lifted up his handcuffed hands from under the blanket. The brunette's smile faded in surprise. She quickly composed herself, however, and plastering her professional smile back on, continued her question. "In your coffee?" Larry watched the stewardess' large green eyes following his handcuffed hands. With a seedy smile, he said, "I know what you're thinking. You wished you had a pair of these last night." The stewardess did not miss a beat. Pouring milk into Larry's coffee, she quickly and in a matter-of-fact tone answered, "Yeah, I would have left the jerk handcuffed to the bed." Ignoring Larry, she turned to Ortega and asked, "How about you, sir? Would you like some coffee?" Ortega was still partially asleep. He had barely caught the end of the exchange between Larry and the stewardess. He yawned and replied, No, thanks." "This guy giving you a hard time?" The stewardess simply smiled. No, not at all." "Well, you two enjoy the rest of your trip." Ortega noticed that Larry's eyes followed the stewardess as she walked away. He was completely shameless. Shaking his head, he said, "You think this whole thing is fun and games, don't you? Because you're going to walk." Larry turned back unconcerned. Shrugging his shoulders, he said, "No, man, I lost about $50,000. I ratted on an old high school friend. Family friend. I don't think it's too much fun." Larry's face had changed. He suddenly looked much older. He took a sip of his coffee in silence, having to use both of his handcuffed hands. Putting down his cup again, he turned to Ortega. "Let me ask you one thing. What's going to happen to her? I mean, if you can prove it was her." Ortega did not seem troubled. He closed his eyes again as he answered Larry. "She'll stand trial. Vehicular manslaughter. Hit and run. She'll do some time in some state prison. Her dad will probably try to buy somebody off. Who knows? Could be a million scenarios. All I know is they wanted me to solve the case. It's my butt that's been in a sling." Ortega quickly drifted off to sleep. Larry tried, but every time he closed his eyes, Mindy's smiling face would appear before him. He spent the night trying to put everything behind him, to think of something else, to sleep for a few minutes, and he failed miserably at all of these. Minutes after Larry's plane landed in Texas, Johnny was getting out of bed. He also felt trapped by webs of guilt and worry, but he had found a quick solution to deal with all of this. He got up slowly, trying not to wake up Mindy, who was rolled up in the bed's white sheets. Wearing only his boxers, Johnny walked over to Mindy's dresser and grabbed the bong. He prepared it and turned on Metallica as he took a deep hit. Mindy stirred in the bed. She opened one eye lazily and pushed some of her hair out of her face. Seeing her stir, Johnny walked over to the bed and offered Mindy the bong. Mindy shook her head, still half asleep. "You're at it already?" Johnny kissed Mindy's arm and neck. "Yeah, I thought you might want to start your day out right." Mindy pushed away Johnny and the bong and tried to sit up in bed while covering herself up with the sheet. "Stoned? No thanks, Johnny. I'll just start mine with some morning coffee. I heard the phone ring earlier. Do you know who it was?" Johnny put the bong down by the bed. "Yeah, it was your dad. I told him you were sleeping. It sounded like he was calling long distance." He walked over to the desk and grabbed a piece of paper. "Here, I wrote down the number. He didn't want to give me any sort of a message. I'm going to hop in the shower. Call him." He reached down and kissed Mindy's mouth slowly, running his hand softly up and down the sides of her figure. With a smile, he headed to the shower. For once, Dwight actually looked awake. He could tell something was wrong by the way Johnny was clutching the stick shift as though he was about to rip it off. He had a sense Johnny could be a dangerous guy if he was upset. Trying to calm him down, he said, "What? Name it, man, no problem." Johnny went on. "I need to get this car painted. I mean, like, now." Dwight understood. "What happened?" Johnny would not be pushed into saying anything. He kept his eyes straight on the road, like an animal feeling chased, as he answered. "Just a few problems. Can he do it or not?" "Sure, why not? You got any more stash?" Johnny suspiciously looked at Dwight out of the corner of his eye. "Yeah, why?" "Well, just give him a few pounds and he'll do you a righteous paint job." "Come on, I know where he's at." Johnny nodded and pulled to a stop as they approached a red light. A few seconds later, a cop car pulled up next to him. Johnny did not think. He simply reacted as soon as he saw the uniform. He slammed the accelerator down, making the tires spin madly, and fired out, taking a sharp left turn, barely avoiding a green minivan. Dwight's eyes almost popped out of his head. He instinctively reached up to his head to pull his baseball cap further down in a nervous gesture. As soon as they passed the minivan, he turned to Johnny and yelled, "You nuts?" Johnny glanced through the rearview mirror and saw the police car turn on its lights to follow them. He cursed under his breath and hunched over to feel more in control of the car. His eyes narrowed and his muscles tensed. Sweat started to pour down his back and forehead, and his hands tightened on the steering wheel. Almost talking to himself, he said, "We're holding on and we're hot. Hold on." Dwight pushed himself into the seat as Johnny changed gears. He took a sharp right corner like a pro. The sparkling red car followed his directions like a purring machine. Every inch was smooth and powerful. They sped down a gravel alleyway at over 50 miles an hour. The cop tried to follow while calling in for reinforcements. "This is Officer Sanders. We've got a 211 on Cuyahoga by 2nd Avenue. Requesting assistance." The Corvette was gaining on the car. The white and black Ford could hardly be as responsive and precise to the will of its driver as the Corvette. The Red Devil whizzed past a row of garbage cans, only an inch away from them. The police car attempted to follow, but just nicked the corner of one of the last cans, which pushed against the rest, forcing the last one to fly straight into the air. It landed right on the Ford's windshield, shattering it into a million sparkling glass daggers. The car came to a sudden stop, and people rushed out of the neighboring houses and stores to help the policeman. Officer Sanders climbed out of his car slowly, using only one hand. His face was completely covered in blood, and he was holding on to his eyes with his left hand, screaming in desperate agony. By the time backups arrived, the Red Corvette had disappeared. All it had left behind was a trail of broken glass and blood. The news was covered that evening, with a shot of the officer's blood-stained driver's seat in the background. The newscaster stated, "An APB has been issued for a Red Corvette responsible for an accident that injured Officer Reuben Sanders earlier today. We'll go live from St. Teresa Hospital with Lucy Alvarez." The camera switched to a young, pretty woman dressed in a navy blue business suit standing outside the ER entrance. Serious and concerned, she took over. "Thanks, Dave. Police Officer Reuben Sanders is still in surgery. Earlier today, he was injured while chasing a red Corvette down a back alley by Kaluga and 2nd Avenue. Doctors are hopeful of saving his eyesight. His eyes were badly lacerated when a garbage can came crashing down on his windshield." The newscaster nodded as the camera went back to the studio. State officials are also looking for a red Corvette that could have been involved in the hit and run of Pepe Santoro earlier this week in San Angelo. The red Corvette lay still that night in Hector's body shop. Hector was carefully taping and spot priming the car when the door to the shop opened and 3 men in their early 20s walked in. Manny was first to see the car and he whistled, moving his head back and forth as though he was appraising a fine female. "Nice car, brother. What color you gonna paint it, man?" Hector cut off the last piece of tape and proudly tapped the car. "Hey, hermano, you're just in time to help me pick. It's a custom paint job. I can do what I like." Juan approached the car slowly. He was a very thin man with short combed-back hair and dark, somber eyes. He was wearing a basketball jersey that showed his arms. They were covered by a web of thick veins, which jutted out of his skin, green and blue. Over all these veins ran tattoos, covering every inch of his skin. On his right shoulder, he had a jack-in-the-box with a skull coming out of the surprise box. On his left forearm, he had the Virgin of Guadalupe. On one tricep, he had an old-style Cadillac, with a beautiful dark woman covered only by her dark hair laying beneath it. He touched the car softly, as if envisioning what it should look like, and said, "Why don't you do the base coat in black and let me do some airbrush work?" Hector contemplated the suggestion for a second, imagining the car turned into a speedy ray of black light. A smile spread across his lips as he shrugged and nodded his head in agreement. "Not bad. Yeah, okay." Once he had a lead, Ortega started to move with lightning speed in his desire to solve the case and avenge the murdered boy. As soon as he finished speaking with Mindy, he tracked down Doug and rushed to the law firm where he worked. Doug tried his best to appear calm and collaborative when Ortega showed up. He repeatedly stated that he knew nothing of the accident, as he had been floating in the clouds on a hot air balloon with 3 other people all afternoon on the day it had happened. Ortega simply nodded and asked Doug to come with him to the police station, where everything could be sorted out. A bit pale, but still trying to appear confident and helpful, Doug agreed. Once in the police station, however, Doug's apparently carefree and optimistic demeanor began to change. Ortega pounded him with one question after the next, relentlessly waiting for a contradiction to nail him. Doug loosened his tie and started looking tired as he tried to keep up with Ortega's techniques. Walking around Doug as he sat at an old water-green metal table, Ortega repeated the same question for the 4th time. "We know the Red Corvette was licensed to you. I just want to know where it is." Doug sighed loudly and answered with an edge of anger to his voice. "Are you hard of hearing? I don't know where it is." Ortega chuckled softly. He came up next to Doug and with a mocking smile looked down on him. "So you're trying to tell me that you don't know where your $30,000 red Corvette is? When were you going to report it missing?" Doug ran his hands through his hair in utter desperation. As he lifted his arms to do so, 2 fresh sweat stains in his armpits were displayed. Ortega noted that Doug was stressed, sweating, and tired. With his hand still on his head, Doug answered, "Look, when I went to use it for lunch, it wasn't there. I was going to call Johnny and see if maybe he had borrowed it. Ortega was losing his patience. He stood looking down at Doug with clear hatred in his eyes. He bent down so that Doug could see the large titillating vein on his forehead as he said, "I know you are an attorney, but if I find out that you're making up this story and I can prove it, I'm going to have you booked as an accessory to murder." He stopped and pulled out a cigarette box from his shirt pocket. Snuffing a cigarette, he started to walk out of the room, saying, "Get my drift, counselor? You're a disgrace to your profession." A few minutes after Ortega walked out, another officer popped his head in to tell Doug that for the moment he could leave. Doug cracked his fingers to relieve pent-up stress, quickly grabbed his jacket, and walked out. He suddenly stopped, however, frozen in his tracks as though he had seen a vision of death. Walking toward him in the same hallway was Mindy, with swollen eyes and her hands behind her in handcuffs. "Mindy," Doug whispered with a look of surprise and shock on his face. Mindy looked up and immediately broke into tears again. "I had to tell them," was all she could mumble. Doug looked disappointed rather than angry. "Why? They couldn't prove anything." The officer leading Mindy stepped in between the two and held a strong hand in front of Doug to stop him from approaching any closer. "Excuse me," she said with a strong street attitude. "You her attorney? We can't have you just talking to the inmates in the hallway. What do you think, this is some kind of party?" Doug shook his head impatiently. He quickly reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a card. "Look, I'm her attorney. Now would you mind if I have a minute with my client?" The officer looked at the card and then at Doug with a suspicious face, but she could not ignore the card. She moved her mouth in a gesture of unwilling agreement. She put the card in her pocket and nodded for Doug to approach Mindy while she stepped a few feet away. With a suspicious demeanor, she said, "Fine, but just for a minute." Doug rushed to Mindy and pulled her to the side of the hallway. In a low, almost desperate voice, he asked, "Why?" Mindy looked down, and clear tears like cleansing rain fell from her eyes onto the tile floor. Neither she nor Doug noticed the tiny crystalline droplets hitting the bluish-gray tiles and reflecting the strip lighting of the hallway. She swallowed hard to find her voice and in a flurry of words answered, "I couldn't sleep after I knew that boy died. Maybe if we hadn't just left him there lying in the dirt. I had to confess. My lawyer quit when I did. He said he couldn't represent anybody who wouldn't take his advice." Doug's right hand went automatically to his forehead to try to rub away the tremendous tension he felt descending on him. In seconds, he seemed to have aged 10 years. He looked at Mindy with a pained expression. "Can't you get out on bail?" Mindy tried to wipe her face on her shoulder. She looked up at Doug with a pained expression, like she had just been asked to cut off her own hand. $10,000? My dad's gonna be pissed." Doug ignored her response. He was speaking rapidly, trying to think on his feet for a way to end all of this. He knew that he would probably not have another opportunity to speak to Mindy, and that it was only a matter of hours before they tracked Johnny down. He ran his hand through his hair again, wiping back the sweat that covered his forehead. Looking intently into Mindy's tear-covered eyes, with a powerful stare that seemed to convey fire and lightning, he said in a deep, urgent voice, "Listen, I know what happened. Johnny told me. He drove off. Only I can't testify against him. He told me in confidence. It's unethical and illegal to break the confidence." Before he could continue, the female officer who had been leading Mindy seemed to lose her patience. She had been leaning against the wall a few feet away, glancing at her watch every couple of minutes. Now she cleared her throat loudly and with decisive steps approached Mindy and Doug. She did not give Doug a chance to complain or say anything. In a curt and bullish manner, she grabbed Mindy by the cuffs as she approached her and, without looking at Doug, started pulling Mindy away as she said, "Hey, that's enough time. You go through the proper channels if you want to talk to her again."
You're listening to Red Corvette, Section 7.
Doug stood motionless with the wrinkled tie he had taken off while speaking to Ortega dangling from his left hand, like a lost lifeline, like a life cut short. He watched the officer lead Mindy down the hallway, stop, open a large iron gate, and walk through with Mindy into a dark hallway where they both disappeared. The iron door slammed heavily behind Mindy's petite frame, which was quickly engulfed by the darkness that surrounded her. In less than a second, the sound of the closing door died away, and Doug was left completely alone under the artificial white light of the hallway, with the feeling that it was all a dream. He could not have just witnessed the same young, cheerful girl he met only a few weeks ago, walking through a door that forbids life. While Mindy was walking down the closed hallway, Johnny was walking down the street from El Capri Motel, where he had paid for a room for a couple of days. He looked relaxed and tough as he walked down the dusty street with a beer can inside a brown paper bag. A midnight blue lowrider car drove by him with 4 or 5 tough-looking men inside. The driver and Johnny exchanged a cold stare, and the driver raised the rear air shock up and down to impress Johnny. Johnny kept looking, yet managed to appear completely cool and indifferent. The 1964 Chevy Impala peeled out, burning rubber behind it. Johnny kept walking until he saw a newspaper box to the side. Casually, he glanced at the headlines. Police officer injured in chase. He put his paper bag on top of the box and reached into his pocket for change. He dropped 2 quarters in the box and pulled out a paper. He glanced at the headline for another second and then folded the paper and started walking again. He dropped the paper on the bed of his hotel room and flipped on the TV. He popped the beer can and sat on the bed, flipping through the channels mindlessly. When the phone rang, it seemed as if he was suddenly awakened from a daydream. He picked up the receiver.
Hello. Dwight, what's up? No, I haven't. What channel? Yeah, I just saw it now in the evening paper. How are they coming with the car?
Dwight was sitting in his room as he spoke to Johnny. He was throwing a ball into the wall and catching it with his right hand as he held the phone with his left.
Listen, I just got a call from Doug. He saw Mindy. She confessed. Except Doug said it was you, man. You just gonna let her take the fall?
The blood from Johnny's face suddenly drained and he looked almost gray with an animal-like expression of anger on his face.
What do you want me to do? Turn myself in? Look, come by, can you? I'm out here in deep water.
Dwight did not throw the ball back against the wall. He held it and was silent for a second.
Yeah, I'll be by.
He put the phone down and slammed the ball against the floor. He grabbed his skateboard and bounded down the stairs, screaming, "See you later," to his parents as the front door closed behind him. He rode down the road to the canal and then followed the canal down the hill. In just a few minutes, he stopped outside the large grayish door at the back of Hector's garage. He walked in through the side door and saw Hector's serious face examining someone carefully airbrushing violet red, yellow, and white flames on the side of a black Corvette. Hector looked up as Dwight put his skateboard down and nodded in recognition. Waving him over, he said,
"Dwight, how's it going?"
"He's almost done." Dwight walked up to the car slowly. With a serious voice, he asked,
"Did you paint everywhere?"
"Yeah, even under the wheel wells. No one will ever know it was red." Manny, sitting up on top of another car, suddenly perked up.
"The police are looking for a red Corvette?"
Hector looked up with a frightening scowl on his face. "Nobody's looking for anything. Anyway, this is a black Corvette. Hey, Juan, are you finished?" Juan was just finishing the fangs of a large demon, which was blowing flames out of his mouth down the side of the Corvette. The demon's eyes were large and seemed to have many layers of darkness, with shadows of tortured, naked bodies dancing through them. Juan looked up after carefully creating a drop of fiery blood on the demon's tooth and smiled.
"Yeah, look, hermano,"
he said, showing Hector. Manny walked over and slapped Tony a high five, followed by a shoulder knock.
"Hell, homie, you outdid even yourself. It's real bad."
Dwight smiled. "Johnny will love it." Juan pointed to the corner by the front right tire.
"Check out the signature, man."
Dwight looked over and read the carefully crafted Gothic letters. El Destructor, the Destroyer, the baddest. Everyone laughed with a general sense of accomplishment. Dwight turned to Hector.
"He paid you, right?" "Yeah, cousin. We've been paid in full."
Hector noticed that Juan and Manny were talking about the artwork and not paying attention to him. He subtly pulled Dwight aside and whispered, "I know this is the car that ran over the homie in San Angelo. Everyone else will know it too. My homie Manny will make sure of that. Don't stay in town with this car. Tell Johnny to get out as quick as he can, see?" Dwight grabbed the keys that Hector offered him. "No problem, cuz." Thanking Juan with a pat on the back, Dwight did not waste a second. He jumped into the driver's seat as Hector opened the garage door and pulled the car out into the dark alley. The demon's blood seemed to glow as the shiny black car sped away. Johnny did not hear the roar of the Corvette as Dwight pulled into the hotel's small parking lot, but the engine's powerful purr was not missed by a group of gang members sitting outside Taco Loco, a Mexican drive-in food joint across the road from the hotel. One of the gang members elbowed his neighbor as the glimmering figure of the bloody demon parked in front of them. All eyes followed the bloody flames as the car rolled into the parking lot. Dwight noticed several angry pairs of eyes following him as he got out of the car. Casually, he waved to the gang and walked up the stairs to Johnny's room. He knocked hard twice on the door as they had agreed. When no one answered, he put his face close to the door and said, "It's me, Johnny." He heard steps and the door opened, but just a few inches. Johnny's bloodshot eyes peered angrily from behind the door chain. In an angry whine, he hissed,
"What took you so long, man? I thought you were coming over hours ago."
Dwight shrugged, looking unconcerned as usual. "I stopped by to check out the car. It's done, dude." Johnny closed the door, took the link chain off, and opened it again, looking a bit relieved, but just as ill as he had a few seconds ago.
"It's not red anymore?"
Dwight pointed across the parking lot to the shiny and slick body of the newly painted black car. "No. Why don't we bring the car back to Doug and you can just leave town in yours? They can't prove anything about it now." Johnny did not answer at first. He stood admiring the slick car and its violent artwork. With a red glimmer crossing his eyes, he let out a mocking cackle. He turned to Dwight and once again looked full of arrogance.
"What's the problem? Nobody's looking for a black Corvette. Relax, we'll be fine."
Dwight could not convince Johnny to get rid of the car. Johnny was too arrogant to imagine that anything could go wrong. After hearing Dwight out, he simply said,
"Let's go to Doug's. I'm gonna get Mindy back."
Without waiting for an answer, he walked out and headed to the car. Dwight shook his head and followed along. Neither of them noticed a black sedan parked across the street from Doug's house as they pulled up to it. Two detectives sitting in the unmarked sedan stooped down as the black Corvette pulled up. They were expecting him. As Johnny pulled the car to a stop, Dwight jumped out, saying, "I'll go get Doug." Johnny turned off the engine and reached into the glove compartment. He pulled out a joint, lit it, and took a small drag before trying to make himself comfortable in the seat. He imagined his thoughts floating out the window along with the smoke of the pot. He reached down and turned on the radio. He needed more noise, more activity to drown out that something, that pressure from within that he felt come over him sometimes, something that was trying to wrap itself around him, the weight. Quickly, he started changing stations, looking for something loud. A Tex-Mex station came on, and Johnny's fingers drifted off the tuner. He started to drift off in the hazy high of the pot when suddenly he heard the passenger's door slam shut. He turned to find Doug sitting next to him, looking furious.
"Johnny, you crazy? Trying to wake everybody up?"
Doug said, turning the radio off. Johnny was in the midst of the sweet high of the marijuana. He simply smiled and said,
"Dougie, how do you like it?"
He pointed to the sides of the car.
"Beautiful, huh?"
Doug looked disgusted.
"You're out of control. Do you know Mindy's confessed? She's taking the rap for you."
Johnny took another drag and blew out slowly.
"How do you know?" He giggled. "And maybe she should. She hit the kid."
Doug shook his head in disbelief.
"Well, if you came forward, I doubt she would do any prison time. You drove the car away, not her."
Johnny laughed silently. He turned to Doug and with a look of cold contempt said,
"Sorry, Doug. I'm not going to prison for anyone."
Doug took a deep breath and opened the door. He got out of the car and then paused. Part of him wanted to help his friend, but another part was disgusted by Johnny's heartlessness. He didn't know Johnny could be so cold. Turning to him, he said, "Okay, look, I reported the Red Corvette as missing. I'm just going to collect the insurance. If I were you, I'd change those plates. The cops can't prove anything." A minuscule concern crossed over Johnny's face. Looking at Doug, he said, "Can you bail her out?" With a sarcastic tone, Doug replied, "You got $10,000? Johnny reached under the passenger seat and pulled out a small duffel bag. "Here's $12,000. Bail her out. I'll pick her up and make sure she doesn't show up for the trial." Doug took the money, looking a bit surprised. "Where are you going to take her?" "Mexico. After a while, it'll blow over." Doug weighed the bag on his hands. He exhaled slowly, as if making a painful decision, and said, "I'll do it. The hearing is at 9 a.m. Don't go there. I'll tell her you're meeting her around the corner." Mindy's father, Duke Jones, had decided to fly back home as soon as he found out what had happened. Ignoring his wife's complaints about their vacation being cut short, he rented a small plane and decided to fly it himself to avoid waiting for a pilot. He was an experienced pilot himself and loved feeling in control of his time and destiny, miles over the clouds. Looking over his plane's gear, Duke called in. "Ground, this is W457 heading in for a landing." A female operator's voice came over the speaker. "Roger, this is Dallas Tower. Flight position W457. What is your ETA?" Duke looked over the clouds. "We have a visual now." He turned over to his wife, who sat sulking in the co-pilot seat. "We're going down." The operator's voice came over the speaker again. "Runway B all clear. Proceed to landing." "We have an urgent message for you at the tower." Deep concern crossed over Duke's face as he listened to the operator. He looked over to his wife. She was looking out the side, unconcerned. As soon as they landed, Duke ran to the tower to receive his urgent message. Slowly and resentfully, his wife dragged behind. With trembling hands, he read, "Mindy Jones released on bond, 8:30 a.m., San Antonio. Present whereabouts unknown." Trembling with anger and concern, Duke stood motionless, as if turned into a salt statue. Duke showed the message to his wife as she walked up to him. "Who the hell would bail her out?" Georgia read the message casually and turned to her purse. She pulled out a makeup mirror and powdered her nose, annoyed at all the hurry and excitement. "She's a big girl, Duke. You worried too much about her. She'll be fine," she said as she closed the makeup mirror. Duke's anger turned to his wife. His face was beet red as he replied in a flurry of words and gestures. "My daughter confessed to a hit and run, bailed herself out, and disappeared, and all you can say is she'll be all right? If you'd quit looking at your own face for just a day, maybe you would see what is happening all around you." Georgia blushed, embarrassed at the scene Duke was making. She turned to look at her purse again, pretending everything was fine. Duke turned to the operations manager who had handed him the message and quickly asked, "Do you have a phone?" Aware of Duke's concern, the manager tried to be as helpful as possible. Pointing to his office, he said, "You can use the phone in my office, Mr. Jones. Would you care for some coffee?" With a look of innocence, Georgia cut in. "Oh, yes, I'd love some." The manager looked shocked at Georgia's blind selfishness. Duke was used to it. Without even looking at his wife, he stormed off to the manager's office and closed the door behind him. In an expensively decorated room, with burgundy leather furniture, deep and rich walnut paneling, and tables and shelves filled with leather-bound books, the governor of the state of Texas was poring over a new state bill when he heard a soft knock on the door. Removing the reading glasses that perched on the tip of his nose, he looked up and said, "Yes?" A valet walked in with a portable phone. It's for you, Governor. Duke Jones." The governor reached for the phone and nodded for the valet to leave the room. "Yes. Hello? Duke? Unfortunately, it made the papers. Anything I can do to help?" Duke had known the governor for decades. They often played golf together, and they both knew the other to be a straight and trustworthy businessman. Duke was now speaking more like a father than a businessman, however. "Just find her.
Look, I put my private eye on the fellow, Doug Thomas. Put out an APB and get my daughter back, wherever she is. I'm sure the guy she was with has her."
The governor, a father himself, could feel the anguish in Duke's voice.
"Don't worry, Duke. I'll personally call the head of the state police. What was the name of the private detective?"
"Armand Morales." The governor was true to his word. As soon as he got off the phone with Duke, he placed several other phone calls intending to track Mindy down. Armand Morales knew nothing of this as he headed to his office later that afternoon. He casually walked to the door only to find his way suddenly obstructed by two tall and muscular men. Armand looked up, thinking that even the gun on his side would be of no help against two probably armed and apparently angry men. Remaining calm, he asked,
"Can I help you?"
He pointed to the door.
"This is my office."
One of the men, the taller one with a crew cut, dark hair, and a tiny diamond stud, spoke up.
"Yes. You're Armand Morales?"
He reached into his pocket, his muscles flexing involuntarily with every movement, and pulled out a police badge.
"Louis Dodge, State Police. We're here to find out what you know about Doug Thomas. Word is you were following him."
Armand nodded.
"I'm sorry, that information is confidential. I worked for Duke Jones. He's the one paying for my time and the one I report to."
Thomas Winchester, the other police officer, stepped in.
"Mr. Morales, it was Mr. Jones who called the governor for help. He's en route to San Angelo, even as we speak. Please, tell us what you know."
Armand opened the door and gestured for the officers to follow him.
"Very well, then. Step inside. I'll give you what I've got so far."
The door closed behind the men as Armand started to tell them what he knew. By the time Armand and the officers met, Mindy and Johnny had already been together for a few hours. They had headed over to the small pond where they had their first date in a romantic attempt to escape all that had happened since that carefree day. Mindy laid on her back, trying to let the sun and warm water rinse off the pain, the guilt, the fear. Johnny swam up to her and softly kissed her stomach.
"I never should have let you take the rap."
Mindy opened her eyes and ran her fingers through Johnny's long, dark hair. She was convinced of his kindness by the sweet way in which he looked at her now. Trying to make him feel better, she said, "I did run them down. It was my fault for getting so high. What'll we do now?" Johnny's eyes seemed lost in the distance as he answered,
"Wait it out and head down to Mexico. I stole some plates for the car, and there's enough money in the car to last 10 years in Mexico."
Mindy's eyes opened wide. 10 years? Johnny's face changed. His sweetness was replaced by anger and impatience at Mindy's fears.
"Look, maybe your dad will take care of everything."
He got out of the water and started walking toward their small campsite. Mindy sat up. She looked into the water as she asked, "You still don't feel sorry about what happened, do you?" Johnny smirked.
"Yeah, I feel sorry we got caught. Or rather, you got caught. It cost me 10 grand.
Mindy sat in silence for a few minutes. She got up and started drying herself before saying, "That's still all you think about. Money, isn't it?" Johnny spit to the side and then looked up at Mindy. His eyes filled with resentment with every word he spoke.
"Look, you have so much of it around you. You've been swimming in it for your whole life. You breathe it. Don't get on me for thinking about it."
He reached next to him and grabbed his gun, checking it for bullets. "You planning on shooting somebody?" asked Mindy with a nervous laugh. Johnny didn't look up but answered with a slightly threatening voice.
"No, but I'm not going to prison either. Not over some Mexican."
He pointed to the cooler with his gun.
"Grab me a beer, will you?"
Mindy's face was pasty white. Her eyes were wide in terror as she realized the implications of Johnny's words. She hastily tried to calm her agitated breathing and to answer in a normal voice. "Sure, why don't you get some sleep? I'm going to read my book." Johnny grabbed the beer can from Mindy's hands, popped it open, and took a large gulp. He laid back for a nap, covering his face from the scorching sun with his t-shirt. Doug had managed to put his conversation with Johnny behind him as he came to work the next day. He threw himself, body and soul, into his work, reading one legal brief after the next, willing with every cell in his body to forget everything else. Thus, a sudden knock on his door startled him completely. Apologizing for surprising him, his secretary said, "Mr. Whitefield to see you, sir. In the conference room." Doug put down the brief he was working on and automatically got up to head to the conference room. Mr. Whitefield, the senior partner of the firm, often called impromptu meetings in the conference room, so Doug was not surprised to be called in at all. He walked briskly and opened the door confidently, then froze in shock. Sitting around the table with Mr. Whitefield were Duke Jones, Delbert, and Detective Simon Ortega. Mr. Whitefield spoke up as Doug remained static, holding the door open as if frozen in time. "Mr. Thomas, please have a seat. Before I ask you to clean out your desk, you need to answer some questions for these gentlemen." Doug silently let go of the door and reached for the closest chair. Delbert looked at him with a pained expression of betrayal. In an earnest voice, which could not wait a second for the truth, Delbert said, "We need to know where Mindy is and who she's with." Ortega, with his usual calculated coolness, added, knowing that now he had the definite upper hand, "We know they're in your car and that you bailed her out. We have reason to believe she may be in grave danger." While everyone else spoke, Mindy's father had been looking at Doug with an unmistakable expression of hatred. Before Ortega could finish, he jumped in. "You slimy weasel! If anything happens to my daughter, it'll be your funeral. So help me God." Duke tried to stand up as he said this, wanting to punch the information out of Doug, but Delbert held him back with a firm hand. Ortega had not moved his eyes from Doug, who looked more and more overwhelmed. Hoping to push him to the edge, he said, "We did some research and ran a police check on Johnny Robbins." Doug's jaw dropped open. They knew everything. Ortega continued mercilessly. "It didn't take much to find out his name. He was sentenced to Habsburg School for Boys at age 11 for setting a church on fire. 3 people died. At age 15, he was with a gang that beat and raped a 15-year-old girl. Normally, these records are sealed. The governor was good enough to pull some strings so we can see what type of man Mindy Jones was with." Doug opened and closed his mouth a couple of times before he could manage to make any sounds. I had no idea. He never mentioned any of that." Mr. Whitefield slammed his fist into the table. "That doesn't change the fact that you got her released on bail and then sent her off with him. You allowed him to take your car as well as alter the paint job after you knew it had been in a hit and run. And you filed a false police report for a stolen car. Hardly befitting for an officer of the court, a member of the Texas State Bar. Believe me, Mr. Thomas, I shall personally file charges against you with the State Bar. But, in the meantime, do you know where he is taking her?" Doug nodded, tacitly acknowledging his guilt. "Probably to Mexico," he answered plainly. Ortega took out a small notebook and wrote something down. "Any places around where they might hide out to make the drive at night?" Doug thought for only a second. He knew where they would go. "The River Wash. We went camping there on one of our first double dates. It's off Highway 38. Pretty secluded." Duke turned to Whitefield. "How far?" "About 30 minutes. We could send in some copters," Ortega said. Duke shook his head. "Too risky. He's liable to run. Let's drive out. We've got a 4-wheel drive. I imagine there are several ways in." Doug stood up, ready to help. "Yeah, there's a 4-wheel path off of Mesquite. It'll save you about 10 minutes. Dehydrated from the beers and the sun, Johnny had dozed off into the sweetness of the afternoon warmth. He awoke suddenly with a fly buzzing around his ear. Sitting up and slapping the fly away, he yawned. He got up and dusted his jeans as he looked around. "Mindy?" There was no response. He looked around but could see no sign of Mindy. He checked in the car and noticed that Mindy's purse was gone. Quickly, Johnny reached for his gun and called out again. "Mindy!" His heart leapt and his breathing became heavier as 2 branches cracked behind him. A squirrel darted around a tree. Suddenly terrified, he grabbed his gear and threw it into the rear of the Corvette. Already covered in nervous sweat, he pulled out as quickly as he could. Mindy had managed to make it to the main highway while Johnny slept. Rushing through the brush, she had slightly sprained an ankle and gotten scratched all over. She saw a beat-up pickup truck heading towards her and rushed out into the road, trying to wave him down with her purse. The man did not even look at her, opening up just enough to avoid hitting her. Mindy looked after the lights of the disappearing truck and put her head in her hands, fighting hard to stop the tears and sobs of desperation that threatened to come out. Delbert and Duke headed the procession to the campsite, with Doug giving directions from the back seat of the Range Rover. Behind them came Ortega. Delbert picked up the radio transmitter of the Range Rover when they arrived to the entrance of the campsite. "This is Cloud 9. Smokey, do you read?" Ortega answered. "Cloud 9, this is Smokey. We read. Wait here. We'll go to the top for a look-see." With that, the Range Rover pulled to the side and began to climb a steep, rocky hill. Overcoming several sharp rock walls, they perched on a cliff that looked over the campsite. Doug pointed to an abandoned cooler with some food around it. "Down there. It looks like they were here and split." Duke's face turned dark purple. "You better pray that we find her and she's alive and well," he whispered. Delbert picked up the transmitter again. "Radio the main highway. There is no one at the campsite. It looks like a recent departure." Duke grabbed the transmitter from Delbert and pointed straight down. "They've got to be heading down for the main road. You can still see the dust. Head down there." Delbert turned to see if Duke had lost his mind. "Are you crazy? That's a 40-degree drop." Duke would not be persuaded. "I'll do it. We don't have time to double back. Mindy needs us. Now, are you going to do it, or do I have to do it?" Delbert turned to look ahead of him again. He forced himself to trust the car and edged over the cliff. Terrified, Doug fastened his seatbelt and tried to press himself into his seat. The Range Rover dove down what looked like a sheer wall of stone. The right door smashed against a boulder with a loud sound of crunching metal filling the air. Delbert was sweating but determined. Duke seemed only concerned by every second they were losing. Delbert slammed the gears in reverse and backed in between the boulder and the mountainside. A loud scraping enveloped them from both sides of the car. In a few more seconds, they were out, but the car had lost both mirrors and was deeply scratched. As they drove into the campsite, Duke opened his door before they had stopped and jumped out. Doug and Delbert followed a second later. Grabbing a light blue jacket, Doug shouted, "Over here! Over here! Mindy's jacket!" Delbert picked up a half-empty can of beer. "Boss, this beer's still cold." He looked at the ground, trying to make out the tracks. "Looks like they're headed this way," he said, pointing. All three men ran back to the car, and Delbert pulled off to the east, following the tracks of the Corvette. Mindy kept walking on the road, desperately trying to wave down every car that drove by. People seemed scared by her teary face and scratched body, however, and preferred to drive away quickly rather than to help her. She heard another car coming toward her. Looking up, she spotted a black dot. She started to wave. Suddenly, as the spot grew in size, Mindy recognized that it was the Corvette. Screaming, she tried to run into the field next to the road. Seeing Mindy ahead, Johnny cursed under his breath and slammed his foot on the accelerator. Mindy was running for her life, but it was difficult to keep her balance on the uneven ground. She stumbled and got up several times. She ran to a fence demarcating private property and tried to cross between two rows of barbed wire. The end of her pants got caught on the wire, however, and as Mindy desperately tried to pull the cloth and disentangle it at the same time, Johnny's car came closer and closer. He stopped the car just about 15 yards away from her. Just as he got out, she managed to pull herself free and turned to run. Johnny pulled out his .38 and aimed it at her. He barely missed and managed to nick the post next to Mindy's head so that several nail-sharp slivers of wood flew into her face, like tiny knives. She did not feel any pain or notice the blood that started to pour from her skin. Looking back at Johnny for just a second, she saw his expression completely transformed. Filled with a cold hatred, with a strong vein pulsating in his forehead like a large horn. His bloodshot eyes looked at her with no feelings as he aimed his gun again. Help! No! Mindy screamed and turned to run desperately like an animal trying to save its life. Before Johnny could shoot again, however, another shot rang out. A bullet grazed Johnny's leg, forcing him to turn around. Simon Ortega was just a few feet away, shooting from behind the door of his car. Johnny retaliated, aiming at Ortega's head. He missed once and then felt a hard thump on his shoulder, which knocked him back against the Corvette. Looking down, he saw his white t-shirt quickly soaking up with blood. He could not lift his arm. The bullet seemed to have severed all the muscles and nerves that connected his shoulder to his chest. He slumped to the ground and tried to pick up the gun with his other hand, but everything was quickly becoming dark. The metallic taste of blood invaded his throat. As Johnny fell to the ground, the Range Rover pulled up from the other direction. Doug jumped out and rushed to Johnny. Mindy looked over and screamed, "Dad, here!" Duke's eyes filled with tears. "Stay right there, Mindy. I'll come and get you." Doug knelt by Johnny, ripped off his shirt and pressed it against Johnny's wound. In less than a second, Doug's hands and the shirt were soaked in blood. Johnny looked into Doug's face.
Doug.
Doug shook his head.
"Don't say anything, Johnny. They're gonna get an ambulance."
Johnny coughed up some blood. His eyes were losing focus.
"It doesn't matter. I can feel something lifting out of me. I feel so cold."
Doug looked like he was in physical pain, watching Johnny die. In a soft voice, he said,
"You better make peace with God, man."
Johnny's face was almost stone still. His skin had become a watery green, his dark hair sticking with sweat to his forehead. A sudden look of fright came over his eyes. He took a sharp gasp of air and said,
"No, I'm not ready. Not yet."
Duke and Mindy walked up slowly. Johnny's lifeless body still leaned against the car, and his lost eyes seemed to be looking toward the demon on the side, El Destructor. Duke held Mindy as she started to scream and shake her head in confusion. He hugged her to his chest and whispered into her hair,
"It's all right, darling. He was a very, very sick boy."
Mindy sobbed. She looked up at her dad with a strange mix of sorrow and anger in her eyes. "But Dad, he said he loved me, and then he was going to kill me." Duke brushed the hair back from Mindy's face.
"He was just sick. That's all."
Simon Ortega's eyes were fixed on Johnny. He turned to Mindy and said,
"I wasn't trying to kill him, Miss Jones. Just to stop him from killing you."
Mindy nodded. "Well, Detective, I wasn't trying to kill those boys either. I hope you believe me on that." The trial went on for several days after Johnny's body had already been buried. In the last day, the courtroom was packed. Mindy sat at the defense table wearing a simple black suit and looking older and calmer. An older man, her lawyer, sat next to her. Duke, Georgia, and Delbert were on the bench behind her. Pepe Santoro's family sat in the next row, with the boy who had survived, still bandaged up, with them. The judge pounded the gavel to read his sentence. In a clear and serious voice, Judge Anderson read out, "The sentencing for this case has been one of the hardest things I've ever had to deliberate. On one hand, we have a 10-year-old boy whose life was snuffed out. On the other hand, we have a 19-year-old girl who has admitted responsibility. I have a handful of letters from the governor on down requesting leniency. In my decision, I have taken into account the fact that this was the first time this young girl has ever been in trouble. I have taken into account that she made restitution to the young boy that was injured. I have taken into account that the family of the boy who was killed has asked me to go easy on her. Mindy Jones, I believe, has paid for what she did that night 100 times more than this court could ever ask her to pay. I am going to impose on her 600 hours of local community service and leave her to the custody of the San Angelo Police Department from 5 p.m. Friday afternoon to 8 a.m. Monday morning for a 9-month period. If she is found to be using drugs during this time, I will stipulate that the community service be dropped and she do 2 years in the state penitentiary for women in Galveston. Will the defendant please rise?" Mindy took a deep breath and stood up. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge pulled off his reading glasses and looked down at Mindy with all seriousness.
Do you understand this sentence, young lady? We are taking away your freedom for the next 9 months of weekends. I want you to understand, young lady, that drugs kill, and people who use drugs frequently kill others. All the money in the world is not going to bring back the life of Pepe Santoro. But I am hoping this incident and this sentence will stop you from throwing away your life as well. A single tear, a mixture of gratitude, pain, and determination, fell from Mindy's eye. Softly, she replied, "Thank you, Your Honor." Judge Anderson pounded the gavel again. "Bailiff, please notify the police department to let me know her progress." The bailiff nodded. In a loud and resounding voice, he said, "All rise. Sentencing having been passed, the state of Texas versus Mindy Jones is concluded." The judge left his seat and walked back to his chambers. As soon as he left the courtroom, Mindy's family approached her. Her father enveloped her in a warm and secure embrace. Georgia's eyes were red and stained with tears. "I guess I've been really dreadful," she sobbed to Mindy, "stealing your dad away from you so much. I feel partly to blame for what happened. Will you give me another chance? I'm not so good at being a mother, but I'll try." She quickly pulled out a delicate silk handkerchief to wipe the tears that threatened to make her mascara run. Mindy bit her lip and took a deep breath. With all the kindness she could summon, she answered, "Yeah, I will." She looked over Georgia's shoulder and saw the Santoros. Mindy looked at her dad and he nodded. The two of them walked up to them. Mindy's throat filled up again with pain. With sincere sorrow, she said to Pepe's parents, "I'm really so sorry about your boy." Mrs. Santoro, her eyes still swollen from crying, reached out for Mindy's hand. She stroked it tenderly, saying, "We know you didn't mean it. Maybe God, Dios, he wanted Pepe in heaven. Maybe he loved him even more than we loved him." Pepe's dad saw Mindy's pained expression and the torrent of tears that began to flow from her eyes. Quickly and kindly, he said, "Don't hate yourself for what happened. It's in the past. Make a new life for yourself." Duke reached out to hug Mr. Santoro. "Thank you for being understanding." The men patted each other on the back with deep emotion. Duke put his arm over Mindy's shoulder to lead her out. Georgia and Delbert were already waiting outside the courtroom. As Mindy walked out, Delbert reached forward and engulfed her into a warm bear hug, just like he used to do when she was a little girl. The end.
You've been listening to Red Corvette, a Boat Angel Family Films production, written by Brian Stewart and narrated by Alexa Lee. For other audio materials by this narrator, please contact the publisher. Red Corvette, a Boat Angel Family Films production.